ultimately what causes us to do our life work is to help other people and feel like, hey, at the end of the day, when you go to bed, like you lived and you mattered to other people. Yeah, now we have data showing that, as people's blood sugar health worsens, their cholesterol can actually go down, right? Which is counter intuitive to what we think. But I think this is still not talked about enough in the medical zeitgeist. Why couldn't we create an app that could somehow integrate all of this data so that we can see in real time and somehow vet that from either LabCorp, Quest, or Clearly, or Boston Heart, Cleveland Heart, whatever?
So how much being a low LDL and living for at least 5 years after you had gotten it checked was associated with living the longest of everybody else in the same data set? It was the lowest when I last checked. I start all of these the same way. Tell me who you are and what you do.
Yeah. Dave, thanks for having me on. My name is Mike Mutzel, and I have a podcast just like you, High Intensity Health. And so I make videos to help people apply scientific wellness principles to their daily living. So exercise, nutrition, whole foods, fermentation, all of that is something I've been naturally interested in for a very long time. And I just want to share that knowledge with other people.
What got you into nutrition?
Yeah, it was weird. Just as a young kid, I was really interested in aesthetics, looking at like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and kids in the 80s and 90s will remember Jean-Claude Van Damme. He was doing karate movies, and I just loved the aesthetic of it at a young age. Like 6 years old, I remember my mom would put on these karate movies, and I just thought, wow, one day I want to look fit like that. And then I remember when I was a teenager, maybe 12, 13, I went to a nutrition store and bought some protein powder, and this gentleman who was working there, he was in his 50s or something like that maybe, and he started talking about essential amino acids and glutamine and all these things, and I thought, wow, one day I want to know as much as him. And I just started like getting really into this stuff. And then I went through high school and wanted to be a physical therapist in college, then got a degree in biology, did the pre-med route, had a really serendipitous interaction with the then chief medical officer of Merck in Boston, and he said, you know what, I wouldn't go into medicine at this time. This was in 2009. And I was like, well, why? Gosh, you can help so many people. He's like, there's so many things you can do health related. And I was working with a medical doctor doing nutrition in his office with his Medicare patients and some resistant patients. And I saw all the documentation. It was like, and this was in 2009, right? It's even worse now. And I thought, gosh, they're practicing medicine, but it's such a short window of time, that they're with patients, and then they're just documenting, using dictation tools and documenting. And so then I got a master's degree in nutrition. I'm really simplifying here. And at the time I was selling dietary supplements to doctors. And so I was meeting with a lot of compounding pharmacists. Actually, Vegas was my territory in Reno, so I was out here a lot. So landing in that airport was interesting. And so I got to interact with a lot of healthcare practitioners all over the country. Then I managed territories in Washington and Illinois and Canada. So I got to meet a lot of great doctors, and I realized they have so much clinical information, but they don't know how to market themselves. And so then I started interviewing them. We had this webinar series, and then I created the YouTube channel in 2014. Just, the practitioners I worked with that were the most clinically savvy, was like, hey, I want to pick your brain on a podcast. And that's kind of how it started.
2014, you said? That's when you got going. So not too long after you got your creds for the nutrition. I never feel like this gets discussed enough, how medicine and nutrition really kind of started out closer together. I'd like to bring up the example of my dad's dad, who I had many conversations with, and he extolled on how he knew his doctor. His doctor came to his house, and it was his doctor who was giving him the most nutrition advice, and also was lambasting him on not getting enough exercise. He's like, no, you need to be eating this. And the thing he remarked on, this is long before I was in this space, is he would say that his doctor, who I think he even went to grade school with, he would have to feel something is truly serious to give you medication. And then even then, if it was something that was like to be taken daily or even, on a regular basis, he would try to get you back off it as soon as possible. And my dad's dad brought this up in distinction with what it is today. today a doctor will commonly say, well, I'm not a nutritionist.
Yeah.
It's not my job to know as much about that as it is to best assess what I need to be able to prescribe to you for a lot of these problems. But I think this is an issue. Wouldn't you agree?
I agree. And I think it's hard to disentangle what's the chicken or the egg. Is it the patient's driving this form of medicine, or is it the field of medicine driving the pharmaceutical prescription route? And I think part of it is, your dad's dad, your grandfather was probably a family practitioner out, hung his shingle out somewhere, and people would come in and see him, and he could see, changes in nutrition and lifestyle or stress or whatever would impact patient's health over time. But now you have these big HMOs and, Kaiser and all these groups, and they're just seeing so many patients, and they're incentivized to help the patient do and give them something, right? Because a lot of people come in and a common thing is they have depression or anxiety or acid reflux or bowel issues. Like those are really, really common, in addition to blood sugar issues and lipid issues. So they want to go home with some tool, right? And so, it's not really the practitioner's fault. They're trying to help the patients, right, so that they come back. But I think it's a combination of where our culture is now with Amazon. Everything is instant, right? You don't even need to leave your house. You can order everything on Instacart, have everything delivered on Amazon. So I think it's a combination of a few different factors. But the cool part about it is many people realize that way of living is not sustainable, because, and that's actually, if we think about it, it's not really science-based, right? So if we think about, there are randomized clinical trials when it comes to statins or anti-anxiety medications or depression. But when you start stacking 4 or 5 medications, there's not a human clinical study showing the efficacy and the drug interactions therein. So we're really...
It's not just that.
Yeah.
It's presumed quite frequently. Oh, this drug gives you a bit of a headache. Well, this drug will help with that headache. So it's not even whether or not they happen to land together in kind of the cocktail of what it is. It's that oftentimes there's an effort to solve a symptom of one drug with the effect of another drug. But like you could run a study where, hey, drug X manages to have symptom Y, and then we have this other drug that helps with symptom Y. Let's run a trial. But trials are extremely expensive. Mm-hmm. That's what they would say is the biggest argument against it, and they're not entirely wrong. But that doesn't help us with regard to better assessing how much these drug-to-drug interactions are meaningful to us.
No, I 100% agree. And so I think a lot of people are realizing that that's not the way to go, and they can conceptualize by way of podcasts and YouTube videos and things, and friends of friends talking, that changing their lifestyle, improving their sleep, mouth taping, walking after meals, doing these basic things can really have a drug-like effect on their body. And so I think that's the beauty of where we are now. Like, you just have random conversation. Actually, on the flight over here, I was coming from Phoenix, and there was a guy, I was in the coveted middle seat, and to the left of me, I was looking at his pot. I was just kind of curious. Like, when the chips and cookies came by, he said, no. And he was a little bit overweight, and he was listening to health podcasts the entire time. Ben Greenfield was on there. He scrolled down to Joe Rogan. I was like, wow, this is awesome. You have someone who is trying to figure out how they can become healthier with this dissemination of information. So I think we're on the precipice of, people are really making sweeping lifestyle changes. And as you know, this way of medicine, practicing medicine like this, is unsustainable. Many of these companies are in the red, because it's very medically expensive to treat patients this way while ignoring the lifestyle factors that got them there in the first place. So I'm excited for this, medicine 3.0, if you will. And
it's a tough question. I want to be optimistic, and there are many ways in which I am.
Yeah.
But just even in the story you're talking about, on a plane, what is the food that's being provided?
Yeah.
What if you yourself are struggling with food addiction? Is that a problem when you're isolated away from healthier choices that you could be making? And what they would say on the plane, or at least those who are, determining what the menu is going to be, is they would say, well, it needs to be shelf stable. It needs to be something. And frankly, more people want this. So we're also kind of responding to consumer demand. But that is a challenge with trying to change this paradigm, is that there are a lot of people would say it's not just that it's going to take more work. It's not that it's more just about the restocking. we feel it's going to put us out of business to try to get better quality food because it both costs more and it's going to get wanted less. I think this comes up a lot in medicine too. To defend the doctors who might not be in the room, many of them will say, yeah, I've tried to talk more about nutrition, but I also have a limited amount of time. I'm trying to get the patient to have some solution. And these are the solutions I tend to know a bit more about, that I feel confident enough to make recommendations on or can write a script for.
Yeah. I agree. I think the counter argument to that, if you fly to Europe, or you fly within Europe, you're given cheese or meat or something a little bit more healthy.
That's true, actually.
So I think there is, people do naturally realize that they would feel better when they eat foods like that, which I think is quite interesting. And then you look at the health sector in general. If you go to LA and go to Erewhon's or go to Whole Foods, and there's a lot of people that are seeking this out. So I don't know that we're going to entirely hit everyone. And really, I don't think not everyone's ready. We're all going to come to this at our own, at our own pace. I think, so it's very interesting to me, but the cool thing is that even doctors are leaving, the ER or internal medicine to practice more of this personalized precision medicine, because they realize that they weren't helping people, that in that way. And everyone wants to have meaning and purpose in their life. And they want to know at the end of the day, like, they're really helping people. And that's ultimately what causes us to do our life work, is to help other people and feel like, hey, at the end of the day, when you go to bed, like, you lived and you mattered to other people. Right. And so I'm excited about it. And I think if you look at GLP-1, for example, though that category, the incretin drugs, have been around for a long time. I know everyone thinks that this just came out, but the first GLP-1 agonists and the DPP-4 inhibitors came out in like 2005, 2006, and they were relegated just for diabetes. And now, sort of off-target use for weight loss, we're seeing a lot of contraindications with that. Like, did you see last week, people are getting blindness from this and gastroparesis and all these challenges. But the cool thing is there's many ways, if we just look at that drug, to activate GLP-1, just slowing down how many chews per swallow, between 35 and 40 chews, like just taking time to chew your food literally activates these incretin hormones, not just GLP-1. There's CCK, there's PYY, there's a whole litany, 26 different incretins that all help with post-meal processing and fat metabolism. So,
I'm kind of glad you brought this up, because often it's assumed that the ultra processing of foods, or at least many people will say it's this aspect of the ultra processing of foods that's the reason it's a problem.
Right.
And I think it's fair to say there may be multiple things about it that we know at a minimum it's just far removed from what we've ancestrally consumed. When we've had carbs before, they were fibrous carbs. Yeah. They always were. So something like chewing, this wouldn't surprise me if it turned out that, of course, given our genetic template, knowing full well that almost anything we're going to be consuming is going to require a lot of chewing,
right,
in order to get the same amount of nutrients. But now we've thrown in something new to the mix, something that has greater fast absorption. And for that matter, if it can move through you faster, that can potentially be a problem, depending on, what state of your metabolism, your metabolic position is, I guess you could say.
Totally.
Your metabolic health is. That's where I want to reach.
Yeah. And if you think about, it's not just the foods that we're eating are different, it's how we're eating the foods in general. And you hear people go to Europe, you hear this in the summer all the time. Like, I went to Italy and I ate the bread or the pasta, and I didn't have the GI issues that I have here. So they think, well, it's the dearth of glyphosate, or it's not as hybridized or whatever. It could be all those things, but it could be that you're more relaxed and you're taking time with your meals. And so,
which is also a common thing with Europe. This is the other thing I believe people don't realize, and I've noticed when I go there, I'm sure you have as well, is I'm already kind of in this mode of the American, we're just dropping in here real quick to eat. And there already is kind of just this difference in the atmosphere. Like, we're not in a big hurry to serve you.
Right.
Not in a bad way, but like the next tapa, for example, might be a meaningful amount of time later than the first one. And that's kind of expected. We sort of expected there'd be more visiting, more. And so this also slows down that process. But that's super common in the culture of Europe. It's really very common.
Totally. And it's really congruent with optimal digestion and post-meal processing. I mean, how often do people start their day with a smoothie when they're driving in rush hour traffic, and then they get to the workplace and they have some snacks from the vending machine? And yeah, of course the macros are skewed, but it's how they're eating those meals as well is affecting the post-meal processing. So, and that's why I'm excited. I'm not excited that everyone's jumping on GLP-1, but it creates this sort of kitchen table topic conversation and opportunity to talk about incretins, which are really exciting, And I wrote a book, it's called Belly Fat Effect in 2013. And it was all about incretins. And I was like, this is the thing. Like, we got to focus on this. But no one gave a crap because no one knew what, like gut hormones. Like, no, we got to talk about insulin and glucagon and this. But like these gut hormones are powerful. Now everyone is talking about it. They get it, right? So just things like going for a walk, exercising, chewing your food, having protein, having healthy fats, they all stimulate these incretins and slowing down, which I think is really important. So various studies have found, just to put a bow on that conversation, taking more time with your meals, and this is in adolescence as well. There's various, I think 4 or 5, Sean Stevenson talked about this in his latest book, studies where families ate together just 3 nights per week. And there was a statistical association with reduced odds of having overweight or obese children by literally just having a family meal, because it's pretty common, sadly now, mom or dad or the caretaker will make food. People kind of grab it when they do, go up to their room, and the kid will play video games or be on their phone. And so the macros might be okay, but we're eating in isolation and not being mindful, not being in a present state when we're consuming these calories. So eating together as a family is a great way to feel better, like obviously, but also have better post-meal processing, and then slowing down and chewing your food. And various studies show that people who eat more quickly are generally more overweight and more metabolically unhealthy. So, and again, these are hard conversations. I don't know it's not as sexy, right? It's more sexy to say, hey, take spermidine and NAD and these, NAD drips and so forth. But mindful eating actually is really powerful stuff. And this is why at these conferences, these keto conferences, low carb conferences, we all feel so good afterwards, right? We're like eating together, having a good time, like talking as we chew our food. Like, this is really medicine, right? And you could quantify this or enumerate it with post-meal levels of glucagon or, GLP-1 and CCK. So it's exciting to me. And I think getting back to the basics is really what this is all about, in terms of optimizing metabolic health.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. A big part of what I appreciate about conferences and these periods where we get to kind of just connect is that, yeah, you're not only getting slowed down because of the conversation, but because of the process of interacting with each other, seeing people that you want to have these discussions with, especially thought leaders in this space. But I do want to say that it is true. Getting into some of the sexy science, which is always fun to discuss, I feel like it often leads to these oversimplifications. Yeah. Too often, something at a cellular level, something in which the microbiome might be getting modified or taxed, et cetera, can then be extrapolated into, and this is how this generates this whole grander theory. And I feel like the human body is so much more complex. And, it's what got me into the Lipid Energy Model, was just trying to focus on that one system was already a lot of work. And just doing it through these experiments took a lot of effort. But even then, I'm still fully aware that a lot of it outside of the lipid system is still extremely complex, and nutrition alone makes it so.
Yeah. I'm curious how that came about. I know you've told this story, but you were trying to optimize your health, and then how did you figure out that preloading blood work with white bread would drop your like, was this just a random thing, or how did walk me through the thought process?
No, this is good. And what is different about what we're recording right now is we've already discussed this in advance. We're going to make this dual purpose, so you'll be able to pick this up for your channel. I'll be sharing this in my podcast, but now that I know I can unpack it, here we go.
Cool.
In 2015, for the second year in a row, I had an A1C of 6.1. And the first year, they said, this is pre-diabetic. You might want to be mindful of your diet. And at that time, I was like hard crashing on a deadline, because I'm software developing. we're eating terrible food around the clock. And I go, you know what? I'm going to do a lot better with my diet. So I had more Subway sandwiches, and skipped the chocolate chip cookie at the end that I was usually having, and tried to alternate between sugary drinks and tea or things along those lines. So I made some proactive efforts coming into 2015. So 2015 comes around, it's March, and I'm excited to get my blood work. Feeling pretty confident my A1C will have gone down. It wasn't. It was exactly the same. It was 6.1 again. And the nurse practitioner, I believe at the time, or sorry, the physician's assistant, said, well, we'll keep monitoring it. And I remember thinking in that moment, I was like, no, we won't. I said, I'm not going to become diabetic. And I immediately thought of everyone on my dad's side of the family that's very diabetic. So it runs in my family. And I said, I'm going to learn what I can do about this. I went immediately to the big boys. I went to the American Diabetes Association's website. I'm reading through their materials, and I'm going through the Mayo Institute. And being a software dev, I go to the forums. And what's fascinating is the most talk in the forums with diabetes seems to be growing more and more around this LCHF, low carb, high fat. And they're throwing shade at the American Diabetes Association. They go, no. They're saying things like, and I was reading it myself, you need to have 60 grams of carbs every meal. Why?
Your brain.
Yeah, right. Like I was thinking to myself, that is strange. Why are they requiring me to do that if carbs get converted to glucose? So I'm going through the forums, but the advice they have to just have more, not just to reduce the carbs, but to intentionally have like low carb, high fat, to have more high fat, and including saturated fat, went against everything I believed, because that's what I was trained into, and especially with heart disease being in my family.
Right.
By the way, if you have diabetes in your family, you have heart disease in your family. Well,
Yes.
certainly, right. So I went, yeah, whatever, I'll try it. But I did remember at that time writing it in multiple forms. If I have all of this saturated fat, isn't my cholesterol going to go through the roof? And at that time, I kept getting the response, well, that does happen for some people, but it's very rare. So I go on the diet. I'm telling this to my dad and my sister, who have sort of their own health issues related to, like, say, hypertension and diabetes. Certainly my dad's A1C was 8.3.
Oh.
So he was up there and flirting with exogenous insulin. He wasn't excited about that. He gets inspired because within weeks, I'm already like losing weight. I'm seeing my glucose drop because I was testing my glucose with a glucometer. All three of us are doing it. All three of us are losing weight. Symptoms are dropping. Hypertension's going away with my sister. My dad's glucose levels are coming down and down and down. And he's like getting better and better to where he doesn't need as much of the medication. And I'm excited. And they get their blood work before me. And I'm warning them in advance, just so you know, this cholesterol thing may come up. I believe in both their cases, their cholesterol went up modestly, a little bit. And I was like, okay, well, so I'm all set. Because if my cholesterol were to go up, it'd be because it was genetic. And my 2 first-degree family members didn't see that. I get mine about a month later. And I remember the exact date. It's November 27th, 2015, the day that my life changed. I'm looking at it. Everything's looking like I'm excited to see my blood work.
Yeah.
I'm looking at it, and then there it is, a fasting LDL, fasting LDL of, I want to say it was 250. And not that I was into lipids in the same way that I am now, but without question,
You were concerned.
I mean, yeah, my total was 357, something like that, and I'm just beside myself. I can't believe it.
Yeah.
I remember, you might find this funny. I remember I was looking at it, and then I would look to other pieces of paper. The whole lab was several pages, and I'd be flipping through the pages, and I would look at it again. And then on my drive home, I actually pulled off a couple times to just grab the sheet again, to look at it again. Just, I couldn't believe that my cholesterol levels went up that much. And so I just, on my drive home, I was like, this diet can't work for me.
Yeah.
I can't do this. I'm not going to kill myself. That's
Sure.
ridiculous. And I had at one point a Subway sandwich back in front of me. I believe it was either later that day or the next day. And I remember staring at it going, it can't be this simple.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was feeling so good. My numbers did improve across the board with everything else. I was training with running at that time, and I was setting personal records. Everything seemed great. And I had to know before I gave it up. Yeah. So I did two things. One, I scheduled a second test, which would take place 2 weeks later. And the second thing was I wanted to learn everything I could about lipidology, even though I had no interest. I before that point, I was only interested in code. And as I'm learning about it, my curiosity is skyrocketing because it looks more and more like a network, the same kind of network I work on as an engineer. It has distributed objects. The contents inside could be packets. You could think of the apolipoproteins as headers. They have a communication scheme in the same way. However, you need to think of them in 3D space because it's not as one-to-one. Anyway, so it's a combination, fear and at the same time fascination. But that said, I'm very depressed. My appetite falls way off. And I'm thinking, oh, you know what? Actually, when I get this second test, I guess I'll have really done an experiment because my total fat and saturated fat is dropping way, way down. Therefore, if my LDL follows it, that's my evidence. That's what I need. I'll bet you know by this point in time, per the Lipid Energy Model, what happened when I'm eating less and less and less while still being ketogenic, while still being fat adapted. What do you think happened to my LDL cholesterol?
Probably went down a little bit, I would say. No, it went up. Hey,
it went way up.
Even more.
It went up another 100 milligrams per deciliter.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, you're just mobilizing more and more fat.
I am, but my adipocytes are taking up less and less.
I see.
They're in a state of release, and therefore there's less of the uptake, there's less of the turnover in the adipocytes. That's what I would argue is going on. Yeah. Which is why, by the way, it flips when I do the quote-unquote Feldman Protocol. So if I overconsume a ketogenic diet, which I ended up doing a little bit later. Well, anyway, so just to jump to that second test, that was the moment where my life really changed. Because when I saw that it had jumped up another 100 milligrams per deciliter, I became obsessed with, I had to understand what the heck was going on. And I started doing a series of experiments. And that taught me the Lipid Energy Model, those series of experiments, one after another, until I started going to conferences, and that led to everything past that point. I started the blog, cholesterolcode.com, and I was just sharing it kind of like a workbook. And as I said to you offline, I kind of miss it. I miss sometimes, even though I felt like I was coming into these discoveries alone and I was trying to shake the trees and get lipidologists interested, the lipidologists weren't interested. People inside the low-carb community, including more and more people were coming out of the woodwork who found my blog, who themselves were this phenotype of people seeing their LDL go up. Like me, often would have family members that went keto and they didn't see the problem, but they did, even though they were more metabolically healthy. That's where this emergence of the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype ultimately came from.
I want to get into that a little bit. I'm curious about your triglycerides. Do you remember your triglyceride number? So your LDL was like 240, you said, milligrams per deciliter?
250, yeah. I can't say that I know for sure, but I know it was probably under 100.
Okay.
I think at one point I did look back at it because of the documentary that we're doing. And when I had the second test, when I was hypocaloric, so I was consuming less and less, I know that my triglycerides were higher at that time, which also fits the energy model. My triglycerides would have been lower if I had done the exact opposite, if I was just over consuming.
Fascinating. For me, so to be honest, Dave, when you were presenting this data to Dom D'Agostino in San Diego, and you approached me too beforehand or after, I can't remember the timeline. And I thought, and then this was back when Jimmy Moore was doing interviews and things like that. I thought this is really interesting, but I was a little bit skeptical because I had sold laboratory testing. It was through a company called SpectraCell. Many people have heard of NMR, Liposcience. I think actually LabCorp bought Liposcience. There's a few technologies.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
with the NMRs, right?
The NMRs. Berkeley Heart Lab got acquired by Quest Diagnostics. So I sold a competitive product to that. And so I was very lipid centric based upon the particles and particle number and the different phenotypes within LDL and HDL. And so this idea of energy being distributed and causing lipoprotein particle shifts, I was like, I don't know about all that, to be honest. Yeah. And so, but I was curious about it for sure. And since what really changed we all come to this with our own thing. A client of mine did a fasted blood work and very lean, metabolically healthy, and her LDL was normally on the higher side, like 180 milligrams per deciliter. She did a fasted HIIT training and went up to like 425. And I was like, whoa, that was like the aha moment for me, because there was no other. In fact, it was so high that a representative from LabCorp had called and reached out, because for some reason creatine kinase was also run on that, suggesting like cardiac stress. And they were like, whoa, you got to get this patient in, they might be having a heart attack and things like that. And I'm like, well, actually they just did a HIIT workout and they're very lean and healthy. So that was really interesting to me.
Do you want my geek speculation on that exact scenario?
Let's dive into it. Yeah.
All right. So cardiomyocytes are the hungriest when it comes to fatty acids. You're probably aware of this. And when I say fatty acids, I don't mean just free fatty acids. I mean specifically the triglyceride payload on ApoB lipoproteins. If I'm remembering this correctly, fact check me later, I believe 70% of the heart's fuel is coming from triglycerides off these ApoB lipoproteins under normal circumstances, right? Now, this is on mixed diets. So take somebody like us who might be a bit more keto, I would say that percentage is probably higher. All right, why is this so important? And why do I usually bring this up when wanting to test my hypothesis with lean mass hyperresponders? Well, you have two giant levers, I would argue. One of those is how would you bring up your LDL on purpose with exercise of some kind? Well, I think the biggest, broadest way is if you're fat adapted, you're bringing up the turnover on oxidative tissues, particularly cardiomyocytes, because they're going to take off those triglycerides from the VLDL rapidly, leaving them as depleted LDL at a higher rate, but they're going to remain in circulation. There's this other interesting lever, which is resistance training, anabolic exercise. That, I argue, but we have yet to test this more overtly, we'll probably need tracer studies for this, that is where muscle tissue growth and repair endocytoses these ApoB lipoproteins, and I would argue are rapidly lysing them, I guess you'd say, in the lysosomes in order to incorporate them into the bilayer for that growth and repair, right? So how would I arrange for the maximum level of lean mass hyperresponder effect to the highest levels of LDL? I would get somebody who's like a runner or a cyclist, or somebody who's doing HIIT but not at super high zones necessarily. Basically, I don't want them to get too sore so that they're endocytosing as much relative to how much they're going to be turning over from those cardiomyocytes, along with being very lean and being very low carb. Then I would expect that their LDL would likely show up at these, FH levels.
And that would explain why particle number would be higher as well, because they're metabolically healthy. So therefore, the ratio of triglycerides to cholesterol within the particles favors cholesterol.
Correct.
So, okay.
It's the turnover. So what do we find already in mixed diet populations? We find that if you get into it, non-HDL cholesterol, so only cholesterol found on ApoB lipoproteins, over ApoB, the one protein that's on each of these ApoB-containing lipoproteins, associates with better health and lower all-cause mortality. Now, that might sound a bit odd because we're basically saying, wow, more cholesterol per particle is better?
Right.
That doesn't make sense. The deposition should be higher and higher, especially if it's, like a lottery. But you find the reverse is also true. If there's more triglycerides per particle and less of the cholesterol esters, that associates with worse health. Why? Because that's more distinct to successful turnover. That's what I would emphasize. If you're successfully turning over the triglyceride cargo on those ApoB lipoproteins such that you have the remaining, triglyceride poor LDL particles, the more successful you are, the more those cholesterol esters are going to be in that pool in the LDL particle count. And that's why LDL triglycerides, LDL-TG, is so effectively associated with poor metabolic health.
See, I wish healthcare practitioners understood this very topic right here. And that was something that I was trying to explain as I was selling this technology back in 2009 to help because just getting your standard LDL and total cholesterol and HDL ratios, it doesn't tell you about the composition of the particles and this triglyceride-enriched phenotype that occurs in insulin-resistant states. And so, yeah, now we have data showing that, you know, as people's blood sugar health worsens, their cholesterol can actually go down, right? Which is counter intuitive to what we think. But I think this is still not talked about enough in the medical zeitgeist.
And now you should know my geek response to that too.
Yeah. Okay.
Why would LDL cholesterol go down for people who are metabolically unhealthy, especially if overweight? I would argue that the present amount of the particle count is less high from successful trafficking, rather high from unsuccessful trafficking in a traffic jam. You've got more ApoB lipoproteins failing to drop off their cargo. And that in turn also has the other components that we're used to in this milieu of, for example, greater heterotypic exchange of cholesterol ester transfer protein. So you end up with the composition of these LDL particles because they're stuck in traffic along with everything else, and they're doing these exchanges in the lumen inside the circulature, as opposed to through the tissue, which is where they're designed to be interacting.
Right.
Your lipid-rich ApoB particles that are coming into circulation, their job is to start big with their cargo and get small. Why are they going to get, small? They're going to get small from lipoprotein lipase activated turnover, because hungry tissues are out there going, yeah,
bring it.
Bring that to me, right? Conversely, if you've got a milieu where there's a lot of cells that are like, I don't have anything to do with, either it's adipocytes that are like, I'm already hypertrophic, I can't take on anymore, or they're oxidative tissues that are like, I got plenty, Randall cycle here, I've got plenty of glucose or whatever. The bottom line is this: I like lipoproteins because LDL in particular is a manifest. When you're talking about the composition, you're talking about a boat that you can look inside it and read out, oh, you know what? Because of the cargo you have on board, I have a pretty good idea of what's happening in the system around you. I have a pretty good idea that you are or you are not succeeding in your original goal when you started out triglyceride and just overall lipid rich. And that's super important. It's so important. And this is the thing that's, all the way here to 2025. This is the thing that still frustrates me, is everybody still is so trained to look through the lens of it, starting with the particle itself. And there's such an interest in trying to find the distinct atherogenicity of each classification of particle.
Right.
And my pushback is, come on, by this point, especially with our
paper.
newly released data,
Yeah.
consider that actually it's the reverse, that the lipid profile is telling us more about what preceded it, and that the same things that cause this lipid profile can often cause the atherosclerosis itself.
A really important paradigm shifting way to conceptualize this. A lot comes up there, but since we're talking about the cardiomyocytes, I just wanted to put a bow on this. There's been several papers showing the failing heart relies upon ketones. Why do you think, and I've read some of these papers and it's been several years. I mean, several of these have come out. So, someone with congestive heart failure, low ejection fraction, if you look at the fuel source, it may be more heavily reliant upon ketones. Why might that be? Have you looked at that?
I'll concede I'm not as familiar with cardiomyocytes and their interaction with ketones themselves. What I am interested in is how much you end up in a scenario where they are fat adapted to where there's detectable levels of ketones, and then looking at that point against fatty acid oxidation as well. Ketones are sexy. They've got a lot of sizzle. We love to talk about them because it's kind of cool that you can get into the state of ketosis. But that's because it's less sexy to say we're on fatty acid diets.
Right.
It's not as cool. But it's still just a fraction of the fate of the fatty acids that actually head towards the pathway of ketogenesis. We're still powered more, especially below the neck, by fatty acids. We need those ketones for above the neck. There's no question. But how much ketones in particular are especially relevant for things like cardiomyocytes, I can't speak to as much.
Yeah. I just thought it was interesting. I wanted to kind of ask you about that. I think there's been 3 or 4 papers with various headlines related to something about the failing heart relies upon ketones. a few things come to mind. So, we talked about the energy model here and how part of the problem with atherosclerosis, well, we didn't really get into atherosclerosis yet, and I want to get there, but the too much energy on board and I'm oversimplifying here, using hopefully vernacular that corroborates with your work, the LDL particles being more enriched in triglycerides, unable to unload their cargo, being more linked with the pathology that causes atherosclerosis, heart disease, and other metabolic health issues. Why is it that I want to get into the oxidation and modification of ApoB is where I'm going here. And so this is where Tom Dayspring and Attia talk a lot about, well, the problem is that LDL just crashes into the vessel wall, right? The arterial wall. But we're not talking enough about the milieu that could cause the so-called crashing to be more problematic, the modification or the oxidation. And where I would like to kind of start this conversation, because we're hearing a lot about linoleic acid and seed oils. We have the Minnesota Coronary experiment, the Sydney Heart study. We have these early studies that have shown that when people consume high amounts of linoleic acid, that is, and comparing, equally matched cohorts, that consume more saturated fat, that there is an increased mortality risk associated with that. So getting into LDL oxidation, where's your mind with that?
Yeah. First, I want to address the crashing
Yeah, let's
thing.
do it.
I say this with love in my heart, but it's just never rang true for me getting into the physics. And I've discussed this with other guests, but just to kind of recap, an LDL particle is 22.5 nanometers, I think is sort of the common average. The lipid bilayer itself is like 5 to 10 nanometers, right? But on top of that, it's got a glycocalyx, it's got all of these transport proteins and so forth. So the idea that the particle smashes through the glycocalyx, through the bilayer, through and around all of the organelles and the cytoskeleton, and then through the bilayer on the other side, like it's gone all through the cytosol, through the bilayer on the other side, has never made sense to me. There are, to the best of my knowledge, there are two ways in which LDL particles can get from the lumen into the subintimal space. And I do emphasize from the lumen to the sub, because there's vasovassorum, you're probably familiar with, is another way, you could call it a back channel way of getting it back there. But there are two ways that I know of. One is in a controlled fashion, in an active fashion through things like SRB1, where it actually is not only taking it in, it's endocytosing, it's packaging it into a vesicle. There's literally transport proteins that are taking it to the other side and excytosing it. That's called transcytosis, transfer transportation, cytosis for a process of the cell. And that is not only a controlled method, but the same group that did the famous 2017 EAS paper that the 3 lines on, it's putting together all these lines of evidence to suggest I think it's literally the title, low density lipoproteins cause atherosclerosis, 2017. The 2020 group did a mechanisms paper that was always planned to be in there. And that paper addresses the fact that indeed, not only is there transcytosis, and there's this more of an acknowledgement by the world of lipidology that transcytosis is happening. That's an active process, not a passive one, not quite as much of the crashing. But on top of that, you've got things like inflammation that increase transcytosis by endothelial cells. Stated another way, there's a plan built into endothelial cells that if they are inflamed, and there are lots of things that can activate this process, they will transcytose more LDL particles, or probably largely just ApoB-containing lipoproteins, through them and into the subintimal space. I believe, and I'll concede it's a hypothesis, I believe this is just part of the innate immune response, because there's value that I think can be claimed with regard to what's normally the innate immune response and getting the things that can address pathogens to the place that they would normally go. Right? Now, this isn't meant to just dismiss the lipid hypothesis in its entirety, but it is meant to try to drill in a bit more. Now, there's one other way that is in fact more passive, that ApoB-containing lipoproteins can enter the subintimal space, and that's, again, back to inflammation. The playbook of inflammation is that endothelial cells separate from each other.
Like dysfunctional.
Especially, particularly like in the presence of mast cells and other inflammasomes that can, or not mast cells, but like histamines, for example.
Right.
that's part of how the monocytes can differentiate into macrophages to get there, because they're gigantic, right? Okay, that's a way in which I could absolutely see many things of the size of lipoproteins getting in. But those junction gaps normally are actually very tight. They're 5 to 10 nanometers with like a zipper basically in between them of all these transport proteins. I've had a tougher time believing in the way that, because they don't come right at, like there's no T intersections in the vasculature. They're not just literally coming and smashing into endothelial cells. You know how endothelial cells look. They're kind of like shingles, right? They're very long and they're gigantic again. So in both cases, these support the response to injury hypothesis. But on top of that, you've got a lot that supports the response to injury hypothesis with regard to where shear stress is, with regard to bifurcations and so forth. And that's hugely relevant when we're talking about this crashing concept. I have a difficult time believing a concentration gradient of LDL particles in the levels we're even talking about actually represent that level of kinetic force and can achieve like pushing it back to the other side. And if that's true, we would expect that to show up with lean mass hyperresponders. This would be a great population to be testing this with, because they have, or many of them have, homozygous FH levels of LDL. 500, 600, 700 LDL cholesterol, which converts to potentially as much as 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 LDLP. You probably already know this from being in the space. It caps out at 3,500 in an NMR. You can't even get higher than that because it's assumed to just not be as clinically relevant, because it just doesn't come up that much. Anyway, I really had to level set with that. You're one of the few people I know can grasp like everything that I'm saying on that front end. Now let's bring in things like linoleic acid, seed oils, and so forth.
Let's pause, because there's so much to unpack here, Dave.
Okay, go ahead.
I want to get into lino for sure, but let's talk about the so-called leaky or dysfunctional endothelial cells.
Yeah,
I think this is really, and this is where understanding health, and we started out with the gut, GLP-1. A lot of people know about intestinal permeability or leaky gut, and they think that, well, if I have leaky gut, that must mean that everything else in my body is fine except for the epithelial cells that line my intestinal tract, alimentary canal, must be porous. But those tight junctions that you mentioned, the zonulin, the occlutin, that affect the endothelial cell permeability are the same protein structurally that affect the epithelial cells in the gut. So I think if you take something simple like, you have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or dysbiosis or acid reflux, or you take antibiotics, like, well, the dysfunction that occurs in the gut probably similarly occurs in the endothelial cells. And so I think that's important for people to conceptualize that, the LDLs aren't just crashing, like you mentioned. There's scavenger receptors and beyond. And this paper right here, it's titled A Century of Cholesterol and Coronaries from Plaques, Genes, and Statins. And this was published by some folks at Baylor University in Cell. They talk about how they say, I was using DaySpring's LDL crashes into the wall, but they say LDL can initiate atherosclerosis by penetrating through dysfunctional endothelial into the walls of arteries. So I think that's an important...
And are they saying endothelium as in it's the tissue? So junction gaps may be what they're addressing directly, or do they mean for it to be going through the cells themselves?
Well, they were citing a paper by Bonetti in 2003. So I don't know that this endothelial transcytosis theory was percolating back in 2003. So I think they're...
Not really, it wasn't.
Probably not. They're probably insinuating that, hey, there is this leaky endothelial cell going on, and that could cause the initiation step for LDL to get into the intima and then cause problems, oxidation, modification, foam cell formation. So what are your thoughts there on this connection between intestinal permeability and potentially porous endothelial cell function?
So two things. One, I do believe that there's not only lots of evidence, but it actually makes a lot of sense physically that gut permeability is a fairly serious problem. Yeah. Mechanical stress there is like a whole nother realm. Like it's not even, because quite literally and this is an area that I also tend to be a bit vocal on. I'm really concerned about people stuffing themselves, like quite quite literally, you're putting stress on the body in a way that it didn't have a lot of options to deal with.
Right.
And yeah, those enterocytes, they're having to put up with whatever. They're one of the first lines of defense, right? So risks for things like mechanical stress do concern me a lot with regard. But then you throw in the other things in the milieu, right? The other things that we may not even be able to speak to as much that can cause further irritation. They'll do the best they can, but I consider that a very different space from the vasculature. Endothelial cells are so tightly controlled, particularly close to the coronaries. So you're probably already familiar with this, and I'm not going to remember the correct names for this, but if you look at how the heart works and its complexity of how it's pumping, the coronary arteries themselves, they have to deal with the fact that they are not very static. Because whenever we're looking at a shot of the heart, we're always forgetting it's literally a muscle that's conforming in a very distinctive way. And therefore, the immune response dealing with repair of those endothelial cells is just naturally going to be more impaired relative to other parts of the body. So even beyond shear stress, there's that conformation challenge, right? I believe that getting back to the permeability question, we're going to ultimately find that endothelial cells are the best at, or for that matter, the immune response is the best at dealing with keeping those junction gaps as tight as possible and under as much control as possible, because it does not take much. It doesn't take much once you're actually within the circulature that you've got a pretty serious problem. And that's why almost half of the cells, the actual cells in our bloodstream, are immune cells. That's why we have platelets on hand at all times, right? Because if it's time for a platelet plug, got to get right on it, right? And that's why the whole clotting cascade, it could be argued that while there's things that have to happen in the subintimal space that need to be addressed, the first and most important piece of the master plan is to take care of the breach. And that's why there's something to do there. Now, can there be things that in the circulature cause greater risk of permeability? Yes, but I think it gets addressed faster. I don't think we have a lot of room for pathogens to get there before the innate immune response kicks in. I think it doesn't take much. I think that's why things like bleeding out can be so serious internally, because there's not a lot that can be done. There's a genuine rate limitation with regard to what you can do.
Right. A lot to unpack there. I mean, when we think about the immune system, I tend to think about the process of atherosclerosis almost like an autoimmune disease, if you think about it, insofar as, what is causing the plaque buildup in the foam cell. I mean, it is an overactivation of the innate immune system.
You think it's an overactivation of the innate immune system?
Well, if we think about, the monocyte to macrophage differentiation, and there's different phenotypes within monocytes and macrophages, the M1 to M2, and all these different pivoting of the immune system, which incidentally, and this was a big thing that I wrote about in Belly Fat Effect, this is all metabolically linked as well. So a more pro-inflammatory innate immune system, or an innate immune system cell, relies more upon glycolytic metabolism, not so much fatty acid metabolism. Like there's a dearth of mitochondria in more regulatory and anti-inflammatory innate and adaptive immune cells. And so it's all sort of connected here. And so you see this immunologic shift. It could happen systemically, and then a consequence of that could be localized atherosclerosis or plaque formation. So I think there's so much interwovenness of the immune system, and not the least of which is that LDL particles neutralize bacterial fragments like endotoxin and lipopolysaccharide that can be a consequence of eating a standard American diet, right? So that, to me, once I started to understand that, I was like, wow, what if lowering LDL cholesterol in someone who is eating a standard American diet is not going to, yes, their LDL might go down, but that could have been an adaptive, aspect of the liver to help to neutralize some of the gram-negative bacterial fragments that are coming in from by way of the alimentary canal of the gut from eating things like McDonald's or French fries or fried foods and these things. So I don't know, maybe we can dive into the immune system, the immunology of lipoproteins. That's something that needs a lot more attention.
Oh my God, yes. I couldn't agree more. And to be sure, there's many great colleagues of mine who've really touched on this a lot. I've got to give a shout out to Siobhan Huggins, but also Nadir Ali has touched on it more. Nick Norwitz has some recent videos, I think, on this as well. But yeah, it's already established that they can bind to pathogens, including in the lumen. They carry alpha tocopherol, which is regularly referred to as vitamin E, and other phenols and trinols. But in particular, I bring this up a lot. I was chatting about this with Peter Tia. I think that they're part of the host immune response in the lumen with regard to, for example, the alpha tocopherol. Because alpha tocopherol, it protrudes the monolayer, and if it runs into another reactive oxygen species, it turns them both into non-reactive products. Again, why this can make sense to me as to why in a site of inflammation, there'd be more transcytosis if they can help with ROS down in the subintimal space. Again, the innate immune response for the non-initiated, and not that I'm into immunology that much, but you can think of it as a dog pile thing. It's get everybody on top of the area of concern, right? And macrophages, freaking awesome, by the way. I love macrophages. But yeah, M1 is the hurt things, inflame on purpose until you can get the scene under control. It's like the cops with the guns, right? M2 is when they differentiate over to being more the emergency worker that's cleaning up and repairing, right?
Right.
But in that M1 state, when there's a site of inflammation, when there's a, let's say that you get an infarct, you get some kind of, nail through a bunch of veins or something like that, they're getting called to the scene to get control. And as they're trying to get control, these macrophages are trying to literally take up as many things. And the lysosome, which we mentioned earlier, they're packed full of lysosomes. They have a bunch of stomachs that are ready to acidify all kinds of things. And they've got a whole bunch of receptors that are just out to reach and grab. And those receptors are specially designed to grab the bad things and to, as best as they can, try to leave the good things alone. But getting back to the autoimmune, this gets to what I would say is my Steelman version of the present day lipid hypothesis, which is that ApoB containing lipoproteins, particularly LDL, will eventually, or I should say potentially, not always eventually, but potentially can get modified. When it gets modified, the macrophage comes along to snag it, and then it stops. It just hangs out there, and it eventually will die, and then other macrophages will attend to it, and that's creating this foam cell. I've always had a problem with that explanation because macrophages move.
Right.
They're actually quite active, and they're good at maneuvering. So I sometimes humorously refer to this as the macrophage theory of obesity, where they're over consuming and they can't help it, they just stop.
They're sedentary, just sitting there on the recliner. Yeah.
But I've got a fun fact to know tell you may not know.
Okay.
Getting back to how macrophages become macrophages, the monocyte, when they get in and differentiate, they have to grow to 5 times their size. How do they grow to 5 times their size? Well, again, I love the structural.
Yeah.
Is it possible that how they differentiate is in part taking up available ApoB containing lipoproteins, since they have the same phospholipids and free cholesterol that's part of the bilayer of a macrophage as well? I think so. And I think that's very relevant, especially for people who have a disease where they have poor receptor binding for their nucleated cells, like homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. I could understand why their macrophages would have a problem with this, and that's why one of my favorite papers is where they demonstrate this with cultured cells from people who had homozygous FH. Indeed, they had different receptor expression because they didn't have the same receptor expression for LDL. But on top of that, they also had cultured cells from homozygous FH on lipid-lowering therapy. And they tended to be more typical of the control. The control macrophages actually had more in common with the ones that had lipid-lowering therapy. So it could be lipid-lowering therapy is of special value to quite literally the immune response of those with homozygous FH.
Right. Okay. So it's more on the macrophage. If I understood you correctly, are you insinuating that in FH there's a macrophage dysfunction?
There's a just
in
a
addition to,
there's a nucleated cell problem,
mm-hmm.
period, because they cannot easily endocytose ApoB lipoproteins. That may sound counterintuitive, but yes, that's a theory I'm putting on the table.
Wow.
Right. So getting back to the autoimmune component,
Sure.
how much is this a positive feedback loop? I'm going to be the defense lawyer for the immune response. I don't start there. I start with, I think that this is one of the most sophisticated systems we've ever looked at. And the immune response alone looks so incredible. I have a tough time with any of us as humans coming in and being like, but they kind of screwed up this part. Mm-hmm. This is a defect that just falls apart all on its own with all of us. I want to see better evidence of that. The problem is that all of the evidence we draw on, like in the case of those who have homozygous FH, right, which is genetic, which is an impairment, like in the case of those who have acquired diseases, right, such as insulin resistance syndrome, we extrapolate from clusters. So you don't just have the high LDL. You don't just have the low HDL, the high triglycerides. You have what actually already independently associates with atherosclerosis. And then the problem is we keep getting stuck in this position where we have people go, well, through statistical instruments, we can subtract the causality of these other things such that we have the leftover causality we feel very confident in. And that's why. That's why when my LDL jumped up, and I'm thinking about it in this fashion, I just kept coming back to it. I kept going, the easiest low-hanging fruit that would have had me leaving the keto diet in 5 seconds was I just needed to find an association between people who have super low levels of LDL and longer lifespans. Right. Something I know you've covered quite a bit, right?
Yeah.
Granted, it's epidemiological, but it should be right there in front of us because we have more than enough epidemiology with, say, things like smoking, right? If you found a population where you're like, hey, did you know in this, country over here, the 3-pack-a-day smokers live longer than the people who don't smoke at all their whole life. Wow. In fact, the people who don't smoke at all, they actually have the highest all-cause mortality. I'd be like, there's got to be more to the story. There has to be. That doesn't fit with what I understand. Is it, or what they smoke, or is what they're smoking some kind of vitamin and not nicotine? No. It's nicotine with the tar and all that stuff. I'd be like, I need to understand more because this doesn't fit with the model as we understand it today.
Are we talking about some data in France or Europe that?
No, I'm using that
hypothetically.
Yeah, I'm using that as a hypothetical to illustrate the point that if you're telling me you smoke 3 packs a day, you're saying, what do you think, Dave? Do you think I'm at a greater risk of shorter lifespan? I'd say, I think so. There hasn't been an RCT for you yet, but that is one of those cases where I think it's a high Bradford Hill threshold that you're probably in trouble. Right. And then you say, oh, actually, no, I know this other country that I would be interested in that because that would break a paradigm that it already had. Basically, epidemiology is not good at proving things, proving causality. It is, however, pretty good at providing evidence against a claim of causality. That's where it's really good. It's a good tester in that regard. And that's why I was hoping, I shouldn't say I was hoping, I was expecting that if LDL is just the lower, the longer, the better, then people who were just lucky enough to be born with low LDL, they would be outliving all of us.
No, they don't. Yeah. I want to get into that data, but let's put a bow on the immune system aspect of it because, and this is known in the literature, the pleiotropicity of statins, how they're pleiotropic, right? Yes, they lower cholesterol by way of inhibiting HMG-CoA reductase, but they also have off-target anti-inflammatory effects. I know you're in a space where you can't really talk so much about this because of your colleagues, but could it be that some of the risk reduction that is associated, although that's debatable based upon the study and so forth, looking at the number needed to treat in various studies, that to me is just a rabbit hole in and of itself. But could it be that how statins could decrease coronary artery disease risk is the off-target anti-inflammatory effects, like we're talking about the macrophage here? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's not actually controversial for me to remark on this. In fact, I'm almost frustrated that if you're somebody who is a big fan of statins, I think you should already be accepting that there could be multiple reasons why a statin could work, and then just be leaning into the evidence if you felt the evidence strongly backed up your position. This is me not actually taking a position even on what the level of the evidence is or how good or bad it is, etc. I'll just say this: when your paradigm is kept to where all the eggs are in the same basket, that it's only beneficial by how it lowers LDL, then you have to also contend with the fact that there are plenty of things that lower LDL that don't seem to have the same efficacy as the data you're trying to hold up for the very population you're describing, right? So if I'm a doctor who believes in how statins work because I feel like the data supports that for the patient I see before me, because they're in the populations of the things that are being studied. Let's say it's secondary preventions, 4S or something like that, low HDL, high triglycerides. And they're saying, should I take this? I don't know if I believe in LDL causing this. As that clinician, you could say, it doesn't even matter to me. I'm going off 4S data. You're somebody who's metabolically unhealthy. You don't seem to be as interested in changing your lifestyle metrics, which I'm just going to say right now do have a much better better outcome with regard to reducing your cardiovascular disease risk. But I can just say to you, doctor patient, that I'm going off of just what the data show for this study, right? This is why I'm prescribing this drug because of what. If instead you're saying because of how much it's lowering your LDL, well, you do kind of put yourself in an awkward position, because then that patient may in fact try other methods to lower LDL. And even prominent lipidologists we know between us actually make that distinction themselves. They seem to hold both positions simultaneously. They're saying, ApoB is the whole ball game. Oh, but also it does matter how you lower ApoB. Those two can't actually be consistent with each other. That's the catch.
Yeah. Interesting. I want to get into PCSK9 inhibitors and things like that, and statins, but another interesting aspect of this, you mentioned the shear stress. So just to let's stay within this endothelial cell and kind of stay within the weeds and then maybe get broader. The shear stress aspect, I think, is really interesting, and particularly in regards to blood viscosity and blood thickness. I don't think that is given enough attention, but I have found this. So I do coaching with clients all the time. I've been doing this since 2006. In my male clients, some of which are metabolically healthy, some of which are not, I put a lot of emphasis on blood donation and hydration because the shear stress aspect of it. And there's been a few studies looking at blood donation, how it correlates with reduced risk of major adverse cardiovascular events because of possibly reducing blood viscosity, but shear stress being a contributing factor to potentially dysfunctional endothelial cells and also exacerbating the atherogenicity of lipoproteins. What are your thoughts there?
Actually, I'm very interested in this, and I haven't pursued that much on the viscosity. I used to before I was on keto. It was remarked a lot that I had very thick blood, which did kind of concern me. I could actually see the difference after I started getting more blood tests following going keto. Now I drink a lot more, and I'm not sure how much you're familiar with this, but I have a lot of salt. I consume a huge amount of salt.
Cool.
And the lower I am on carbs, the more that's actually something I pursue. I think I'm more of an edge case, but not so much of an edge case that there aren't other people like me who also supplement salt. But since then, my blood viscosity is relatively low. It seems more consistent with what I would expect for blood. I joked that I couldn't give any more blood because of how much I'm already giving to data, because often they'll take when I did wide spectrum blood tests, it would be like 18 tubes. Oh, wow. Or sorry, not 18 tubes, 12 tubes. Sorry. But I think it was 18 tubes over 2 days is what I limited myself to, so that I wouldn't
have other issues, anemia or whatever else.
Well, and also confound the data. So the more blood I'm having removed, the more that could impact existing experiments that I'm doing.
Yeah.
But I think viscosity is relevant. I do. But that's another one of those correlations I want to understand a little bit better. So for example, how much is the blood donation relevant to what is too high in the blood in the first place, such as too much iron, for example, could be an important component. I don't know.
I agree totally. But
again, it gets back to, does this intervention at least have some associative data? that's useful. Doesn't necessarily prove causality, but this intervention seems to have, you're studying this prospectively. That gives you something to go on that you may want to choose to pursue.
Yeah. I mean, the reason why I'm interested in it on several fold. I have a friend, Ralph Holsworth, who created a blood viscosity test in 2010, and I think they ran out of funding, but he thought that this was, and he worked with a prominent medical doctor. I'm drawing a blank on his name, in the Seattle area, and I can't remember where it went. But if we look at I've been tracking all-cause mortality statistics and heart disease specific mortality over the past 5 years. And if you looked at 2021 and 2022, there was a pretty significant jump in cardiovascular specific mortality in terms of the overall deaths. And you could ascribe that to a lot of different things, associations with pandemic lockdowns, stress, joblessness, all of that, but also getting COVID in and of itself and the high antibody levels. And also post-immunization, the antibody levels do increase blood viscosity. So to me, I just thought that was a really interesting aspect, something that we should be considering, especially because there's this Yale Listen study that is coming out looking at people who have had adverse effects of different therapies that we really shall not name. And some people still have S protein antibodies that are really high, even years after taking the thing that we cannot talk about on YouTube. So that to me is particularly interesting because I have a friend of mine who's a CEO of a tech company, and one of his top engineers, his antibody levels to the S protein are like orders of magnitude higher than the normal cutoff point. And his hemoglobin hematocrit and RDW and RBC are just off the charts, like everything, his iron as well. And so he went to donate blood, and it took him like 15 minutes. Normally when you donate like a liter of blood, it takes you or I would take 6 to 8 minutes. So the viscosity was quite high. And so they were like, what do we do? And I thought, well, sauna, hydration, exercise, post-meal walking, long road trip, stop and go out and move would be very important. But anyhow, it's maybe wishful thinking, but that maybe medicine would consider blood viscosity, in this narrative as a contributing factor in the arterial atherosclerotic pathophysiology.
It's definitely, I think, an important question as to how it gets to be what it is.
Yeah.
If the viscosity is just much higher, yeah, I'm very interested in what the root cause could be in those circumstances. But I really do like all-cause mortality. It's not, it's kind of like C-reactive protein. It's very non-specific, but at the same time, it's a great gauge for something's not going right.
Yeah.
And, again, getting back to associational data, a lot of times this is the value, I think, with diet experimentation. You're doing an intervention, maybe you're trying out a new meal, or maybe you're trying multiple different kinds of meals. You're in a better place, but it's hard for you to discern how much each of those components played what part. Could be only one thing in the entire, clump of the things that you've changed are different or turned out to be the most relevant. But at the same time, that's just the challenge of not living every single day and with every single thing in a lab where you can isolate the aspects that are the most relevant. When you talk about the event that we shall not name, so many things changed all at the same time.
Yeah.
And it was kind of an unfortunate experiment in many ways that we couldn't best understand. The scientist in me often wishes there could just be opportunities taken whenever a world event happens to where a bunch of countries or districts or so forth could say, hey, you guys do the intervention, you guys don't, etc., and take advantage of that data to be shared amongst us all.
Yes.
Right. But then again, I would get criticized heavily for this. I'll say that there's some tiny percent that I wish was always maintained as a placebo for every intervention that ever happens while constant surveillance data is captured. That's like a hugely controversial thing for me to say. You know why? Because basically what you're saying is
you want people to die, right?
Yeah, or just that the intervention that's thought to be a bulletproof, there's no way there could, why would it'd be unethical to allow for any number of people to not actually get the intervention. But how often is it that something was thought to have been universally beneficial and for which we really had no good way of revising without a hugely expensive trial? It's a tough one. It's a tough challenge.
I agree. I mean, I think you could have easily conducted that trial by at least having people that had proof of natural immunity and didn't get the thing that we're talking about, and then followed different cohorts and just looked at various health outcomes, immunologic biomarkers, etc.
Can I get meta with you for a second?
Yeah.
Isn't it fascinating that today in 2025, I am fully aware. There's already almost a meter in my head right now going, ugh.
Why did he mention that? Yeah.
It's already, and it's frustrating to me because I love the honesty of science. It's supposed to be about truth seeking. It's kind of like comedy shouldn't have any joke that can't be told. Science shouldn't have anything that shouldn't allow for challenge, right? It should just be an open conversation. But every time I've thought that the nature of information technology and its advancements, especially the internet, opens up this larger marketplace of ideas, I find that we keep getting back to this place where we kind of have to self-censor for survival reasons, right? Like both you and I, we have careers that are highly influenced by our social media connection and how much we can, continue as best as we can what we hope is helping other people while not getting sidelined by something that's like an unforced error. I do wish that in our lifetime we would see that change, where there would be a way by which these questions could just get asked and not even be thinking twice about things like self-censoring.
I agree. Yeah. And I think part of it is just the nature of the algorithm and these network tribes that are created. And it's more, when you understand the psychology of it, people tend to identify more with what they collectively disagree with compared to what they agree with. And so when we talk about whether it was during COVID, whether it was if you question lockdowns or you question school closures, you were a science denier because the so-called experts said that those modalities will save lives. While, at the same time, if you looked at people, in Sweden and Nordic countries that were putting out information showing that, hey, school closures don't actually increase childhood mortality. Leaving schools open do not increase childhood mortality. That individual, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he basically deleted his Twitter account. He published it. I think it was in JAMA, right? Showing that leaving schools open was actually a good thing for kids. There was not an increased all-cause mortality or children dying compared to other, countries who were doing this. But the network tribes just attacked him online because he was so-called anti-science. So I think it's hard for us to be honest sometimes about disentangling our political biases from topics that have nothing to do with politics, and so I think politics have unfortunately gotten woven into everything. Everything is politicized now, whether it's gender, whether it's reproductive rights, everything. And so what I like about Europe is there's a spectrum of politics, right? 16 different parties, in France. A friend of mine is from Lyon. And so you're more likely to align on any given person that you meet on the street. You're going to align on several issues. Whereas here, the two-party system, it's you hate everyone on one side or the other. Whereas, I think we all inherently have left and right things that we think are good, and so we're all kind of in the middle, but we are forced based upon our network tribes and the information that we see to really bifurcate to one side or the other and then hate the people that disagree with us, which is really unfortunate. So
it is.
It's sad, man.
It's kind of crazy to me to think about. I steer as clear away from politics as I can online. Yeah. And this has less to do with the algorithms and so forth, but I want to help you if you're a Trump supporter. I want to help you if you're a Kamala supporter. I want to be, there for you in either way. And so I'm always mindful of even weighing in on an issue that's of some topic. There was, at Cynthia Thurlow on episode hasn't aired yet, this whole podcast hasn't aired yet. This may come months and months from now. But we were chatting about, she wanted to put up a link for the California fires. The California fires were happening. Mm-hmm. And she got some pushback for that. It was like literally just a charity link, and she was using her profile to bring it up. And I was like, how could that even be political? Like, I don't even know what the nature of that would be.
I think there was some thought that it was man-made, and then, but so buying into that would foster this something restructuring of LA for the Olympics. Like, there's all these ideas as to why the fires got out of control and so forth. So I could see, looking from afar, like 50,000 foot view, why that might be deemed political. But yeah, she's just trying to help people. Like, what the hell, man?
Right.
Yeah.
But, again, we just got to work within the system we have. Getting back to Europe for a sec, it is something. When I was growing up, I was appreciating that the nature of our history, and I'm doing my best not to drop into any kind of politics here, but I'll just say I've always thought this worked really well for us for a quarter of a millennial, right? Like, it's 250 plus years. We've managed to do quite a lot. And even if it landed to where it seemed like we sort of had two parties bouncing off each other, the progress has been pretty strong. When I've gone and traveled to all of these other places that tend to have multiples of parties, and especially how they can kind of grow but also die. They can, some of them, stand for a long period of time. But if you're really having a problem and you create a third party, it actually has potential viability if there's a lot of people standing behind you on it. And even if you don't truly gain power to become the majority, you actually may still be a coalition builder. So your interests can still get met in a parliamentary system. And it's to that extent, I have appreciated watching that unfold and chatting with some Europeans about how that can work. Again, there's lots of problems too.
Yeah.
I think we're, always watching both labs work and not work in different times. But right now, I'll concede. I like the thought of third parties having a lot more prominence and potential in many respects. So I don't know.
No, I agree. And then equally so, I think it's great to have conversations with people who disagree with you. That's how we learn. You don't want to be in an echo chamber and always have someone confirm your biases, right? So I like to talk with people on the left, on the right, whatever, and just hear why they agree or how they feel about certain topics. It's a good opportunity for learning and growth and understanding. So we all live in this planet together, right? We might as well understand each other and be able to coexist. But getting back to lipids, there's one hypothesis that we tacitly alluded to but haven't really fully addressed, and that's the continual exposure hypothesis.
Right.
This idea that, and some of these papers are insinuating that we should start aggressive LDL reduction strategies, LDL lowering strategies at an earlier age, because this process of atherosclerosis starts to happen as early as, I think, in utero potentially, and then there were some autopsy studies in children at 4 years of age. So this idea that the more LDL we have and the more it's crashing into the vessel wall, that means that later in life we're at higher and higher risk of having a major adverse cardiovascular event. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll be honest, and I'm going to be very technically precise, the concentration gradient version of the lipid hypothesis has never quite made physical sense to me. Okay, the reason I state it that way is, if the claim is that with greater and greater concentration that's present at all times, there's going to be greater and greater risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, then there should be some characteristics that are quite predictable. That's where the EAS 2017 paper comes from, right? The catch is, if you look closely at that graph, it's not actually amount of LDL over time. It's exposure to lowering. But everybody who looks at that graph, 99% of people we could talk to right now believe that that's actually a scatter plot on the amount of LDL, how much LDL you have versus how much risk you have for development of atherosclerosis. The exposure to lowering, unfortunately, bakes in some confounders to it, right? And that's why what I would always have wanted to do is to do exactly what we think that graph is showing us, exactly what you just described, which is let's just go ahead and get people who have historically very different levels of LDL lifelong. And now getting back to, to Europe, we have, for example, actual countries that do have data in its completed form. The catch is something we do here that they don't do as much there is we have things like annual exams. Mm-hmm. Often in more of the socialized healthcare systems, you don't bother them unless you've got a problem, right? And then they'll do like the blood work and so forth. Yeah. What would be more ideal is if we had annual exams so that we could have had something like trajectories over time where we can observe how much the quote unquote LDL cumulative burden really applied. And I speculate right now, as has already been somewhat informed by studies that were the largest on PCSK9 loss of function, that having historically low levels of LDL doesn't necessarily mean you have a benefit in all-cause mortality. But importantly, they do tend to have lower cardiovascular disease risk, right? Now, why am I making sure that both of those are being said at the same time? Because the important question is whether or not there is a trade-off. If you're dying more of one thing, that means you're necessarily dying of everything that's not that one thing, for example, right? And it very well could be that taking steps to lower LDL in given contexts really will have a net benefit in not just reduce cardiovascular disease, but also in lowering all-cause mortality. And it could be argued, like I just mentioned earlier, with homozygous FH, that could explain a lot. But what does happen in the case of, say, lean mass hyperresponders, in the case of somebody who's metabolically healthy, but with sky-high levels of LDL? Well, if this is just that simple, that the concentration gradient of LDL particles, particularly ApoB-containing lipoproteins, will drive a greater risk of atherosclerosis, we should absolutely be seeing it in our population. Because again, we're not just talking about people who have an LDL of 140 or 150, right? As I just mentioned, we have, in our own study, we already have people who have an LDL of 400 or higher, which means their LDL particle count is 400 and higher. You would expect that in 5.7 years from when they started the diet to when we had the second scan, there'd be a pronounced and clearly elucidated, level of plaque progression, or for that matter, just presentation of plaque. We should see higher plaque at baseline, but that's not what we were seeing.
I'm curious. So there was 100 participants in this study that were tracked for a year. What's the longest duration of CTA to CTA that you've seen in someone who's a lean mass hyperresponder with, LDL over the threshold is 190 milligrams per deciliter? What's the delta that you've seen so far, the biggest?
As in, what participant has had the longest time that they've been on the diet?
Yeah, like where's the median, like where they have CTA, like where they started the diet and then got a coronary artery angiogram and then got another one. Like, so this was a year. How are you starting to see, is there people 5 years out with LDLs above 190 milligrams per deciliter?
Well, there's the average time for our population, for our cohort, that they were on this diet from baseline. Baseline was 4.7 years. And therefore, the year after, the average was 5.7 years. Gotcha. Of course, there's going to be some that were more than 5.7 years from when they started to when they got their second scan, and some that were less. But I don't have access to the individual data because I'm appropriately blinded. So even though Adrian Sotomoda is my colleague, he's the biostatistician, I do not ask him questions that I am not effectively cleared by the team to ask appropriately. Again, funders, one of the things I'm critical of, and anybody should be critical of, is how much funders can have meaningful control to do do-overs and things like that, right? So for the most part, I'm hands-off on where the biostatisticians take the analyses. I just emphasize that I care about it being much more of a report, of a capture and report, which I'm very happy we've done. Not too much interpretation, relatively speaking, but to try to provide, what it is we were shooting to get. And so getting back to individual data, this might be a question you could ask him. And
maybe, yeah.
I'm neither endorsing he answers just questions from Mike Mutzel or not, any more than any other person, but it's up to him as to what he decides, he would want to do with the data. It's ironic because, of course, I'm doing the super hard work at like raising the money, getting the whole thing of, founding the organization, getting the study going, and then ultimately I'm handing it off to be like, okay, let's see what the data say.
Yeah. I want to just pause, and this is something I've been thinking about for about a year and a half, and that is that the way that we're practicing medicine right now in terms of asking these critical questions like you're doing, which is phenomenal, right? It seems a little archaic. It's sort of like pulling up the phone book to call a taxi cab when we can just use an Uber. Why don't we have an application? Like I think we're missing out on a window of opportunity to help people because there's so many people who are eating this way who are not part of your diet or study, right? You have 100 people. There's millions, billions of people on the planet. Why couldn't we create an app that could somehow integrate all of this data so that we can see in real time and somehow vet that from either LabCorp, Quest, or Clearly, or Boston Heart, Cleveland Heart, whatever, because it seems like it's going to take way too long, so many quality adjusted life years are being lost at this, how we were doing, nutrition epidemiology at this point. So,
I think about this all the time too.
Yeah.
You're already familiar with our service, Own Your Labs.
No, I'm not familiar.
Own Your Labs there's already existing services that exist that are like this, which are, it's like Amazon. You go on the website, you choose the blood work you want to get, you add it to your cart, you check out, and then there's an ordering physician that makes the requisition that's licensed in the state that you're in. And then you go ahead and take that and to a LabCorp, get your blood work, and then it's, you have access to it. And then, of course, appropriately, we say, be sure to share with your physician.
Yeah.
But ultimately, you were in control to get that. Yes. Right. All right. We have an additional component to it, though, that the others don't, which is we have a checkbox for whether or not you want to join your data anonymously with the Citizen Science Data Archive, CSDA, right? And the purpose of that is if you check that box, we give you 10% off. You have to fill out a little extra demographic information. If you do that, then that gets added to the pool, and it's kind of like NHANES, except better.
Yeah.
Because, well, in some ways better. Because if you're getting unusual labs that there isn't a lot of data on, especially if other people are joining in with that along with the demographic information you have, there's a way to do further subgroup analysis against that, right? But on top of that, I know there's not hardly any open source data sets on low carbers. There's not really a good one that exists right now. Instead, there's millions and millions and millions of dollars spent on these studies that usually have a particular question in the way that you're describing, because I share this concern with you, that then end up in a data set that's very carefully managed.
Yeah.
It's very proprietary. And it may be that they, with permission, share for other analyses and so forth. But let's face it, it's a small number of people controlling a large amount of data. It's very relevant to our lives, Mike.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So what's my dream scenario? My dream scenario is Own Your Labs. We continue to expand. We have things like coronary artery calcification scans that you can get in the area that you're in. We detect where you're at if you share that with us. And we have like local partners that we can connect with. Same deal though. We'll give you 10% off if you want to go ahead and link that to an anonymized profile. Again, we take away, first name, last name, state, et cetera, et cetera. But hey, even if there was just 20 lean mass hyperresponders that were, say, like you, that you could like look up and check, that you could run your own very ad hoc analysis, would you appreciate? Of course you would. You'd appreciate having something to work off of. And the more those data expand, the more there can be more robust analyses, depending on what you're trying to shoot for. And it's our goal, and it's what we say to the people who check this box, for this to just be available without barrier. We would make a lot more money if we held it.
Yeah.
But it's against the philosophy that I really want for the citizen science. Here's what I think. If I were the president of the world, I'd require that at least a small proportion of the population get effectively the equivalent of a part-time job's salary to have all of these wearables, to get all of these different, when there's new blood tests that come online, right? That may be meant for certain sick populations, but if it's low risk for healthy people to have it, I'd want to get those tests with healthy folks. We should be testing healthy folks all the freaking time and robustly, because instead, the problem is we keep extrapolating from unhealthy populations and setting reference ranges and guidelines and all kinds of things that I think is just it's not in our best interest. If we just paid to study more healthy people and then made those data available without restriction, I'll bet it advanced science substantially, and I think it would deal with this exact problem we're both concerned about.
That's amazing. Would you, in the foreseeable future, have a tool where you could upload verified reports from Quest or LabCorp?
I would love that, yeah. But
I'm sure it's technologically hard, but that would be really cool, because let's say I were to go on tomorrow and do it, which I would do because I want to contribute to science in that way. It'd be nice to look at the historical labs as well, and then maybe create I don't know, that would just be fascinating, because again, going back to the network tribalism, there's so many people that say, well, you can't do carnivore, it's bad for the planet, it's bad for, what about TMAO or whatever the thing is that they say. And then, if veganism really is the sine qua non of longevity, like the experts say, well, let's compare active healthy vegans versus active healthy carnivores.
100%.
Track them over 10 years. We're never going to get that from Stanford or Harvard or these NHANES sub-analyses. So it's going to take...
And if we did, it would be some very short-term trial.
Yeah.
And they would go more off markers, which is what they do right now anyway.
LDL.
Yeah, LDL. It's a marker for cardiovascular disease risk. So therefore, we're going to conclude this is at a lower cardiovascular disease risk, this group versus that group.
Yeah.
Very common.
Yeah. Well, along those lines, we could argue that living to your 100th birthday is a good proxy of overall health. You're doing something right. The data that you've looked at through NHANES, and we have the Amoris lipoprotein cohort out of Sweden, found that higher LDL at the age of 65 is statistically associated with greater odds of becoming a centenarian. Does that what are your thoughts there? And then does that corroborate with the data that you've pulled from NHANES?
Yeah, I'm gonna steel man as best as I can the counter argument. Okay. So what would regularly be said, and I'm going to try to make this for them, is they would say it's just reverse causality. People who have lower LDL and are close to death, it's because they are dealing with, say, sarcopenia and organ failure and so forth. And I think there's some validity to that to an extent. Mm-hmm. I say to an extent because this is where you can do something like censoring. You can go ahead and say, all right, well, let's not look at populations, or let's look at a population, but exclude those people who died within 5 years from when this set started, right? So NHANES being a good example, NHANES 4 started in 1999. I believe that was the first. And for people who don't know, it's in North America, and it alternates every other year. So there's an NHANES 4 2001, there's an NHANES 4 2003, etc. And what you're referring to when I did this before, and the data's I think the first time I did this was 2019, so I'm kind of interested in coming back because there's even better data now. They did follow-up. So they looked to see if they died, what was the code for what they died for. Most of the time they have that code. Sometimes they don't, but at a minimum you can get all-cause mortality. Did they die at all? Mm-hmm. Right. And my last analysis, getting back to centenarians, yes, I was looking at the cutoff for age was 85. So they look at everybody who's really, they look at children up to age 85, but you're supposed to, for public analyses, only look at people 18 to 85. I was looking at anybody who was who could have become a centenarian. So they were in the NHANES long enough that when their age started, they could have gotten to age 100. Mm-hmm. But there is a catch with NHANES. It's kind of an important catch, which is that if you're above age 85, you will be brought to 85. Mm. So we don't actually know how many, because it goes, you see all the ages rank up, and then on 85, there's something like twice as many or 3 times as many. It's because if you're older than 85, they bring it down. They say it's for anonymizing reasons. But they will say that the average for everybody in that range actually is more like 88. Okay, so when I was just looking at the hard cutoffs, and I excluded 85 and looked only at 84 and earlier. Yes, I found that higher LDL associated with lower all-cause mortality.
At any age?
Or
65 and over?
Of those, of like 84. I want to say it was like 79 to 84, something like that. I'm kind of going a little bit by memory. Now, it's more like a hockey stick is the way I would describe it. So sorry for anybody who's listening to us, but on the left side where the LDL is the lowest, you tend to have the highest all-cause mortality. Mm-hmm. And you see this with associational data all the time. Even when I censored people who died within 5 years of when they got their examination. So there had to have been at least a follow-up of 5 years or longer that they were alive before they died. So does that make sense? Mm-hmm. This helps to rule out reverse causality. 5 years is a long time. So how much being a low LDL and living for at least 5 years after you had gotten it checked was associated with living the longest of everybody else in the same data set? It was the lowest when I last checked, right? Now, the hockey stick part is, while that's the lowest, the all-cause mortality is the highest here. For the rest, it's flatter. Mm-hmm. If you get far out to the right end, there's potentially more association with all-cause mortality. The catch is that this changes once we get back into metabolic health. If you start playing with the HDL and the triglyceride levels, it becomes relevant as to, and that's why I like to look at the triad with older populations. Then it gets really interesting. Just to restate this again, because I think a lot of people miss this, but they shouldn't. If you become metabolically unhealthy, if you develop metabolic syndrome, literally 2 of the criteria of metabolic syndrome is low HDL and high triglycerides. Literally the criteria of atherogenic dyslipidemia is low HDL and high triglycerides and a preponderance of small dense LDL particles. Why the preponderance of small dense LDL particles? I would argue it's because we're back to the traffic jam issue. Mm-hmm. You've developed a higher relative LDL cholesterol, and you've developed a much higher ApoB by changing the environment of your body to become less healthy. So bringing this back to the all-cause mortality, that's why I don't like when they adjust for those lipids. Instead, go ahead and look. Getting back to compare healthy with healthy, apples to apples. We only just now got health-conscious carnivores. That's new.
Right.
Everybody who was eating red meat before was probably the same people who were ignoring their doctor on smoking and more sedentary. Hey, we now have that. We're losing data. We should be getting this data of health-conscious carnivores as they're going, which is why I'm happy about this study, because we have a lot of carnivores in it.
Yeah. I love that. In this J-shaped association, you talked about the hockey stick. There's been many studies, and they talk about in the, whether it's the abstract, the discussion, the so-called cholesterol paradox, where, seemingly the people with the lowest risk of all-cause mortality or cardiovascular specific mortality, but depending upon the study, is, I think an LDL window of like 130 milligrams per deciliter up to 180 milligrams per deciliter. On either side, the J-shape or hockey stick like you talk about, there's increased mortality. So, And many of the so-called pundits on Twitter will say, well, it's because the people with really low LDL, they have all these diseases going on, and that's why their LDL is low. But like you said, what percentage of those people is it? We know I think it was Get With the Guidelines in 2007, looked at 150,000 people who presented with acute myocardial infarction and chest pain and things in the hospital. And then the 50% of them had LDL less. I want to say it was more like 70% had LDL that was greater than like 100, 199 or 100 or something. I'd have to look at it.
Yeah.
But it was a significant proportion of people had what would be considered clinically low LDL, yet they were presenting with cardiovascular complications.
I'll do a pushback on that one.
Okay.
In that, I don't necessarily consider that as strong a data with regard to its presentation. So having a heart attack does impact lipid levels, and potentially it can even bring down LDL, right? This is, by the way, this is why that certain disease state that we're not talking about had an association at presentation also with the lower your LDL, the worse the severity of the outcome of that given thing. And I was waiting, thankfully it eventually came. I was waiting for there to be annualized blood work. So when they just visited the doctor before this disease came about, that's better data because that's more likely to be their historical lipid levels.
And what does that data show in reference to the?
Well, definitely they focused in on HDL and triglycerides. Didn't bring up LDL, which to me was
a little questionable.
Was a signal.
Yeah.
To me. Like it, for sure, I think if LDL had that association with severity, I would expect it to come in. I don't want to be too presumptuous. I'm just saying this is the pattern that I've seen over and over again. I brought this up with a certain cardiologist a long time ago with regard to, for example, the 4S trial. The 4S trial is the only study that I'm aware of that actually did a stratification for those who had low HDL, high triglycerides within the 4S data set. And sure enough, they found for those people who had high HDL, low triglycerides in the placebo group, they had very little difference between those in the intervention group, right?
And the intervention in that was statins?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was simvastatin, I want to say, something like that.
Okay.
And when I was bringing this up with the cardiologist, and this was in a live thing, he was like, well, they don't have as much of an interest in shrinking their demographic or something like that. I'm like,
okay.
But then I brought up and he said that in response to me saying, why haven't they done this analysis more?
Yeah.
Like, why not identify a group that's not actually at risk?
Right.
That's part of why is, potentially just saying, if it can be seen to be applying to more people, you'd almost rather the data get diluted. And it's almost like I can make the case for them, hey, maybe a certain population and in a certain time frame gets the best efficacy for this. But if we stratify this and then we can look at the stratification outside of it, we can find that this population doesn't. Possibly. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you pushed back on that study with regards to acute presentation of coronary syndrome, because yes, these lipid levels, cholesterol, it's an acute phase reactant, right? So you would see, you would notice that. And I was curious about that association with the C19 and low LDL and increased mortality, particularly because of the immunologic response and trafficking. The immune system is very expensive. I mean, to finance an appropriate immunologic response to an infection or trauma is metabolically expensive. And so, of course, there's going to be changes in lipids. So that is really interesting.
And let's keep that on the table for one more second.
Yeah.
This is also why, in the most basic way I'd put this, I call it my backlog theory. If you just remember that your immune system is rate limited, you just described it.
Yeah.
Of course you're going to have problems when it's busy at the time you've got a new problem. Of course it makes it worse. So yeah, one of the most frustrating things about that thing we all went through is that it was probably one of the best times we could have gotten everyone interested in resolving that, resolving metabolic health.
Yeah.
We had the strongest connection of data of metabolic health and severity of outcome ever in our hands.
No one cared.
Yeah. If you ever had one of those times where you could say, like your life depended on it.
Yes.
Well, that's why I created this shirt during that time. Eat like your life depends on it.
That's true.
It's like, dude, let's go here.
Yeah.
But everyone's like, no. The experts aren't talking about that. So therefore it doesn't make sense. You're like, oh my gosh. Okay. Whatever. Well, anyway, let's keep this conversation going with regards to immunology. So I have an interesting theory with regards to implicit in this conversation has been poor metabolic health. Obviously shifts in LDL particle and things like that, high triglycerides, low HDL. And we think about, everyone talks about, it's insulin and having a high insulinogenic diet, high glycemic index diet, inactivity. Sure, but could it also be that since we're talking about the immune system here, we know that subclinical inflammation, chronic smoldering inflammation, we talked about the shifts from the M2 to M1 phenotype within macrophages and so forth. All of these immune cytokines also impact insulin signaling, right? So I think there is a subtype of metabolic dysfunction that would necessitate more anti-inflammatory regimes or protocols. And that could be why the ketogenic diet is effective, because of the beta-hydroxybutyrate and the so-called NLRP3 inflammasome and so forth.
I feel like you touched on what my Occam's razor is, which is lower insulin.
Yeah.
A lower insulinemic environment, because that is highly connected to the immune response.
Right.
If you're hyperinsulinemic, you are broadly a bit more pro-inflammatory because it's anabolism time.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And so I've long believed you can outcompete your immune response. If you're eating round the clock, I think you're setting yourself up for big trouble. And I'm not even talking about overeating. I'm saying if you're just eating, if you're doing like a midnight snack right before you head to sleep, right? Man, I don't sleep as well. Oh, until I actually have ice cream before I go to sleep. And then that helps to knock me out. That's great. Okay. But your GI tract it's fully engaged now, right? Right as you're heading into your circadian rhythm. Also, your insulin levels are higher. I think, and I talk about this all the time on this podcast, I think your immune system needs closing hours.
Yeah.
I think you need a span of time as much as is necessary for the recovery of whatever you're doing. So if you're an ultramarathoner, you should really plan recovery time. I'm sure you've seen this quite frequently with runners. They can often suddenly be shocked that they have a CAC of 500, right? What the heck? How is that even possible? I'm running like every day.
Yeah.
I'm running every day, 12 miles a day. I should have really? That kind of says a lot right there. You're binging of a different type.
Yeah.
But I think you're outcompeting your immune response in a different way there. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah. Very interesting. A study just came out looking at coronary artery calcium score in like recreational athletes, finding indeed they have higher coronary artery calcium. So you're insinuating that there's a misbalance between repair and output.
Yes.
And so the repair is not sufficient. So therefore coronary artery calcium could be.
And I bring this back to atherosclerosis, full stop. I believe a lot of the story, Mike, of atherosclerosis is less about how we get the injury. It's more about the inhibition of the repair. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
If you're these plaques that develop, I know they're always discussed as though it's a perpetual positive feedback loop. It's just going to keep going and going and going. I don't believe that. Or let me put it this way. I'm not saying that it's not possible. I'm saying I'll bet the vast majority of plaque development is in a stage closer to lower level hemostasis, where it's a wound that appears and our immune system is actually pretty decent at dealing with it. And just like a scratch on our arm, it can deal with that where you can't even tell there was a difference. If it's something worse, then it's more like a scar. Fatty streak could be a scar, but at the same time, it can be plenty stable and there's really never going to be a problem with that. Or it could be something where actually it's a complex injury. It's having a difficult time dealing with it because unlike the outside of our body, the inside has scarce space, especially in the vasculature. And so they got to be careful.
Yeah.
Especially if, like I said, it's a coronary artery on something that's constantly conforming and never gets a break.
Right.
I think that's all relevant.
Speaking of that, what is the role teleologically of the calcification of the fatty streak and foam cell? Like, why do you think osteocalcin and all these things are increased and cause that calcification? Have you dove into that? I haven't.
I'll concede I've not delved into it as recently. The process, there's a name for it, the calcification process specific to atherosclerosis. But the Occam's razor for me, I believe, is that it's a choice between two outcomes, neither of which may necessarily be as desired. Like the best is if you can bring back the supple aspects of the endothelium. But just like with a scar is, well, this is better than letting it just continue to hemorrhage. And I think it's the same thing with a complex wound in the endothelium. Is I think you get to a point where you want to pave it over. But this is me saying a very high level and not being able to give a more, nuanced response with more of the recent. I know you get into these things. A lot of the anatomy of the endothelium has actually made lots of advances in the last few years. And so this is sort of me saying I'm kind of going off more of what I've come to understand in those early days, especially not just from 2016 to 2019, but 2019 to I want to say around 2022. is sort of when I got a lot more in depth on the vasculature, but even then there was more that had advanced in just the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
And calcification was one of those interesting areas. I am fascinated by the concept of there being slopes over time, and this is where longitudinal data would be great, because I just don't think these things are positive feedback loops where they only go in one direction and they only continue to. I think that some amount of our immune response has already shown in many case reports to be able to reduce plaques, not just non-calcified plaques, but in many cases calcified plaques.
Mm-hmm.
Not that that's always even desired, by the way. It could very well be that consolidation of calcified plaques in some circumstances is the most appropriate and best outcome for what you're looking for. But really, a lot of this is still very unknown.
Yeah. Objectively measuring that, do you like the Clearly test? I have a lot of clients who have done that.
I do. There's a lot of trade-offs with everything. And as somebody who is a software engineer myself, I recognize that it's an emergent technology. I'm going to do this with every emergent technology, but I'm really happy that we had it for our study, because it meant that every single scan would have, I think something like 96 out of 100 scans had some detectable plaque volume. That's good, because then we can track progression. The irony, though, is plaque volumes were so low for so many of our patients that, again, you're trying to track very small amounts of change. But at least it gave us something to work with.
The baseline, comparing to the Miami Heart cohort, the lean mass hyperresponder cohort had quantitatively much lower plaque volumes.
So there was two things. One, the match analysis we published was on total plaque score. That's semi-quantitative. That's not Clearly.
Okay.
There is, however, a presentation I gave on preliminary data where we did look at plaque volume, which was through Clearly, and did do a comparison with Miami Heart. That was in, I want to say, August of last year. Was at Low Carb USA. And what's fascinating about that one is, yes, it was nearly the same, ours versus Miami Heart, with regard to non-calcified plaque volume. I think it might have been total plaque volume. But then there was a subgroup, because many were pushing back on the match analysis, because 1/3 of those in the Miami Heart cohort had lipid-lowering therapy. So they were on something like a statin. And so we did a subgroup that matched there was 80 in both groups, and then the subgroup that excluded those with the third that had the lipid-lowering therapy, we matched back to our 80, and it was 56 to 56 that matched on our side. And it was, again, it's about the same. In fact, ours, I think, had lower total plaque volume to their 56 comparators in Miami Heart. So again, they look like basically a healthy cohort, even when we had a great matched comparison with Miami Heart.
Yeah. Fascinating. But in both, there was like a 0.08% increase in plaque volume over time. So is that just a consequence of aging?
I think you're talking about the PAV, percent atheroma volume.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So this is, and here's the catch. I already said Clearly is emergent. PAV is also actually kind of emergent in its own right.
Okay.
So there's only a certain degree with which I even am comfortable talking about it, because probably we would need Adrian here to speak a little bit more to this. And full disclosure, I actually like plaque volume more than I like PAV, me personally. But that's because I guess you could say I feel better about it for AI guided reading, but that's more a preference thing on my part. So
who's doing plaque volume outside of Clearly, or what?
I think that there are other services like Clearly that are doing AI guided reading. So you send them the scans, they do their magic with the software. The intent is for it to be as objective as possible, that there's not actually a human reader that can have human bias that's applied to it. Okay.
So anyone can get a CT angiogram and send it to these different companies that will enumerate the plaque volume.
Yes, although I'm pretty sure Clearly is in the lead on that one.
Yeah. And then what's your concern with the radiation of doing a CTA periodically?
So that concern, I kind of tout how low my concern is. I've had two already.
Okay.
It's the radiation dosage used to be like 10 times what it is now, maybe even more. When I got both of my CT angiograms, they were about 2 millisieverts each. You know what that is, but for the general audience, just free living in this world, just walking around doing your thing, you get about 3.5 millisieverts is kind of the average. A mammogram is 0.4 millisieverts, if memory serves, and a CAC, a coronary artery calcification scan, which does pick up calcification, is like 0.5, 0.6, so just a little bit more than a mammogram. A CT angiogram, therefore, is what, 5-6 times that or something like that. There's that radiation exposure, which I would consider really modest now that it's that low. But on top of that, there is one other consideration in comparison to, say, a CAC, which is that you have to have contrast dye. They go ahead and intravenously inject contrast dye, which makes it so the lumen will show up in the CT. And that is, I want to say, complications of note for the kidneys is something like 1 in 10,000, something like that.
Yeah.
So again,
small, but
interests may vary as to how much somebody wants to do something, but I will probably get another one. I'll probably get another one in a few years.
Yeah. What's your cadence look like? 5 years for CTA or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a special case because my CT angiogram is almost entirely clean. So me getting another one, it's a little bit for the science aspect of it. I know a lot of people will be interested. Certainly I'm interested. But another part of it is just getting older.
Yeah.
I'm a bit older than you are, and father time will bring a lot. One of the biggest pushbacks that I find amusing is that there's like any plaque progression. Our cohort did have plaque progression at a population level. But even before we had the second scans, once I knew our demographics, that we'd have 55-year-olds, 100 average 55-year-olds, mostly male. I was saying even before we had the second scans, 100% expect that there'll be population level increase in plaque, or to put it a different way, bring me any group of 55-year-old average cohorts that will not have an increase at a population level of plaque. So that's kind of the catch. Now, as far as how much we can elucidate, every potential contributor to plaque, that's part of what you and I have fun chatting about, but a lot of it's still theory.
Yeah. And maybe let's finish up on that and talk about LDL and triglycerides. I mean, when I look at blood work with people I've been working with, I first like to look at the liver enzymes, the HDL, triglycerides, ApoB to A1 ratio. But it seems like, in my opinion, and based upon the literature, and even I was curious, Dayspring talked about this a lot. He said, if I could just look at 3 biomarkers, it'd be, I think he said VLDL, I want to say, or definitely ApoB, but HDL and triglycerides. I was like, whoa.
No, he didn't say HDL. I don't think I think he's very bearish on HDL.
On HDL, yeah.
I think what the most recent podcast I've seen him say this is it's ApoB and triglycerides. Like he'd be the most interested in that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if he had a third one.
Maybe it was just those two. Maybe it was wishful thinking about the HDL. Yeah. But anyhow, I think the triglycerides are under-recognized as an independent risk factor for all these problems.
Of course. But to be fair, again, I think it's downstream. I think your triglycerides being high in a fasted state, emphasis fasted, right? You're low carb. Are you keto? Like fully keto, or?
I cycle carbs. I was fully keto for 5 years, and then now I cycle carbs seasonally based on my workouts.
The only reason I bring this up is if you're ketogenic and you're getting a test not at 12 hours fasted, let's say you get it at 8 hours fasted, I would expect your triglycerides to be high.
Yeah.
Right. And I showed this with, at a blog post, I called it the triglyceride carryover effect, because I was getting my lipids hour per hour in a PTS diagnostics. And I saw that even as much as, I want to say in the 10th hour fasted, again, this is overnight, 10th hour fasted or even 11th hour fasted, it could still be as high as like 150 or 200.
Wow.
Only after I'd hit about 12 hours, past the dawn phenomenon and everything else, did it come down to under 100 every time, right? Every single time. The scatter plot's kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
But the reason I bring this up is if you're going to your doctor's office today, they've changed it. They used to make it to where you need to go get a fasted blood test. Now they go, well,
we want to see
convenience. Let's just go and get your blood work right now. So some number of low carbers still keep coming into the groups going, I just got my blood work and I had a 200, triglycerides. And everybody knows to ask the question, was it fasted?
Well, I think it's good to compare fasted to non-fasted to see what the delta is. And there was a consensus statement paper in 2010. It's just like the glucose tolerance test, lipid load test. Let's compare the delta to see what degree of postprandial triglyceride dysmetabolism does one have. Now, I think if you're on a keto diet, that might be a little bit different. But I found, this is why in 2019, maybe it was 2018, I can't remember, I stopped drinking bulletproof coffee because I started to reread those papers, and I found that liquid fat would have a disproportionate increase on my post-meal triglyceride level. And what the experts recommend is basically have a meal, and in that 90-minute post-meal window, go and get your triglycerides run. And so my fasted triglycerides are usually around 60, 65. And after having a bulletproof coffee and like avocado and eggs, it went up to like 220. And I was like, whoa, that's a lot.
Let's debate this for a
Let's
second.
do it. Yeah.
All right. Here's what I think's happening.
Okay.
In that scenario, your basal insulin is low.
Yeah.
Your bolus insulin is low. So you consume something, but you did not get enough of an insulinemic response that your triglycerides were being taken off at a more rapid rate, because insulin does induce greater lipoprotein lipase activity, right? Now you might be like, oh no, this is bad. I want insulin to induce a greater amount of lipoprotein lipase activity. Why though? Why is that important? Your body acts on the glucose delta. It cares a lot about it not getting too high, not getting it too low.
Yeah.
It doesn't act on the lipid delta, particularly the cargo onboard ApoB lipoproteins. That's why I can change my numbers to ridiculous amounts, right? Up and down over, again, hour by hour. I can show this. I've got it in the graphs from all the experiments that I've done, but particularly in the triglyceride carryover. I would expect if I were to have a bulletproof coffee right now, and I don't drink coffee, it's bulletproof something, right? My diet hasn't been as good in more recent days, so I would expect my basal insulin might actually be a little bit higher. I'll bet my triglycerides would be lower because of that. But let's say that I was being militantly keto, full-blown carnivore, etc., right? And I had the same drink. I would expect that an hour, 2 hours, etc. later, my triglycerides would actually be much higher. But I don't think that's an indication of harm. Because my body is not, what would my body's response be? I am installing those triglycerides literally from the food I'm consuming.
Right.
It has to get to ridiculous levels before it's even detectable in the serum from like a centrifuge or something like that, where you see like the foam and so forth. You have to get up there. But generally speaking, I found that from my own experiments, it almost never gets above like 200, 250, 300. So there may be some point at which it acts on it. It's just, it's a much wider delta than it is for glucose.
Totally. I can see that with a low carb individual. I think these papers were talking about this in the context of like your average person,
which is serious.
Yeah.
If it's somebody who's on a mixed diet, if it was a family member of mine who I know is consuming carbohydrates on a regular basis, I would absolutely expect postprandial triglycerides to be higher, the same way that I would expect it to be for glucose. If those are higher, why is fuel sitting in your blood when there is an insulinemic response? That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. What do you think? Is there inherent atherogenicity of triglycerides, or is it because the reason why they are high is driving other pathways that would cause increased risk for major adverse cardiovascular?
It's absolutely the second.
Okay.
I know that the simplicity of these kinetic models is so attractive. We want to think, aha, it's this particle. It's, I brought up remnants originally in 2018. I was doing like talks on it and so forth, with an emphasis on these are not I don't believe these are inherently atherogenic. I believe their high association has to do with what it takes to end up in a situation where these levels are high. So I said this as an off-the-cuff remark at that time, and I kind of actually took a lot of flack for it. Is I said, I don't believe lipoproteins are atherogenic or inherently atherogenic, I think is the way that I put it. I believe that broken systems are atherogenic. And took a lot of heat for it because, again, the simplicity of lipoproteins being atherogenic is just, it's considered to be sacrosanct. The me of today would reemphasize, I don't want to make a claim that people take to, affect their healthcare. I don't want people to take it as I'm closed off to the possibility that the kinetic hypothesis works. Just that until we do things like study people for which there's not these clusters, where we're studying people who have the element of interest, sky high LDL, sky high ApoB, we cannot know. Not to that degree. That's why we had to do it.
Love it. LP little a is something that comes up for a lot of people. I've seen this interesting correlation in my clients that I work with. Oftentimes people who have high LP little a's also have sleep disorder breathing or sleep apnea. So I wanted to talk to you about, the probability that it's more atherogenic and so forth. But what weight do you put in a high LP little a?
So you brought up acute phase reactants. I know you're familiar with them then. Is LP little a an acute phase reactant? Absolutely. Right. And it's not only that, it's involved in, for example, the helping with the, I want to say helping with the clotting cascade, but that's not exactly right. A better way of putting it is it's part of the construct of, for example, fibrin and so forth to help stop the breach, right? So the reason for the elevated LP little a, I believe, is extremely relevant, and that always gets to the core of causality itself. If something is truly independently causal, then the reason for why it's high and its association with a given outcome is less important. But I think it is important. And as it happens, we have a paper that's going to be coming out soon on our cohort with LP little a. But I already have some preliminary data that you could look at right now on cholesterolcode.com that goes back to that talk I was discussing with the plaque volume comparison with Miami Heart. And the LP little a did not have an association with plaque volume at all. Right. And so I'm glad we also got it because I knew this topic would come up a lot. So just as with ApoB lipoproteins, I think that there are three things that impact its level, or at least three very notable buckets. One is genetically high levels of LP little a. Another is the inflammation, if it's actually an acute phase reactant response because you're inflamed. And the third is metabolic. If you're a lean mass hyperresponder, for example, and my colleague Siobhan had shown this many times over, her LP little a would go up and down with the inversion pattern. So in the same ways in which we play with our diet to change the LDL levels, they would follow the LDL levels. They were actually, I want to say it was an R squared of like 9.9 or something like that, right? Okay, but that one's hardly ever studied. The amount of association between LP little a and someone being inflamed, understandably, is going to have greater association in turn with atherosclerosis. So we, again, needed to get perhaps this last piece, genetically high levels of LP little a. I don't have genetically high levels of LP little a, so I can't see it. My colleague Siobhan does, and Nick Norwitz does. Nick Norwitz has sky high levels of LP little a.
Sky high, like
I want to say it's like 200
nanomoles per liter. Wow. Okay.
Again, if it follows lipid trafficking, it would make sense why we would have a cohort that uniquely has many people that have that. So do I think in a lack of inflammation, we're going to see that association? So far, we're not seeing it, which again, kind of brings me back to the kinetics. I know there's such, it's just easy. It's easy to digest. It's easy to understand this physical aspect of these ApoB lipoproteins, including LP little a, independently driving atherosclerosis. But we only ever could know well, I shouldn't say we only could ever know that way. We could have already done subgroup analyses, and we have, long before I came into this space, to look at metabolic health versus these lipid levels. and that already gave us clues, which is part of how I ended up here.
Yeah.
But now with lean mass hyperresponders, I'm excited because we're getting these data, including Lp(a).
That's awesome. Amazing. Do you want to finish up on the paper? I mean, we've already kind of talked about it, but
yeah. I mean, I would say the title says it all.
Yeah.
You know, if you have standing levels of plaque, if you had plaque in your baseline scan and you're in our study, it was very predictive of whether or not you would have more plaque in the second scan. Plaque begets plaque. But all of the lipid metrics we were running, LDL cholesterol, ApoB, Adrian Sotomoda, to his credit, even did subgroup analyses where, for example, he isolated those who had both high ApoB and high plaque development to see if there was an association between ApoB and plaque, at least in that subgroup. He did it for those who had CAC of 0. In all of these models, there just was no association. There was no association between ApoB and corresponding plaque development.
Wow. Does that surprise you at all? I mean, just a little bit.
I want to. It's rough because there are definitely some things I've been wrong about. If you thought, I'm going to be so painfully obvious in this moment, I think I'm just on the euphoria from the paper having been released yesterday.
Yeah.
But for anybody who's listening, for anybody who knows that I've been through 5.5 years of this, I mean, we gave the very abbreviated version, but the founding of the Citizen Science Foundation, getting this study off the ground, it's raising hundreds of thousands of dollars from individuals, right? All of this effort, obviously, I had a very strong level of optimism. Was I completely certain? Not really. I don't know that I'm ever certain. I think to be a good scientist, you kind of have to leave a lot of margin of doubt, or you're just not being a good scientist. But did my confidence grow, particularly as we continued, particularly as more anecdotal data came in? It did. And the baseline data before this had gotten, when we did the match analysis, that was probably one of the most pivotal moments for me. Was I remember I was actually at Low Carb USA, I want to say 2.5 years ago, something like that. And that match analysis had come out, and it was on my laptop, and I was like reading it, and I was just blown away. And it turned out that the filmmaker that I was working with, Jen Eisenhart, was joining me for lunch where I was at, and I was just staring at it. I was like, this is some of the most compelling data I could have ever seen. And that was the match analysis. That wasn't even the longitudinal. But the match was very powerful because now you're looking at an otherwise healthy cohort for comparison. And given the delta of 700 milligrams per deciliter in cumulative LDL exposure of our average versus their average.
It's hard to argue with that.
It is. It's very... So, yeah, I want to be able to say that without emphasizing that we still need to get more data. You know, we're going to have an extension to the study, hopefully locked in pretty soon, to where we'll get 5-year scans. I doubt we'll be able to keep everybody. We may re-recruit, I don't know, 60 maybe of the 100. I don't know. We'll find out. But it's a very... I don't know another way of putting it. Obviously, I'm very satisfied that that this group of people is not the high risk group that they're assumed to be, at least at a population level.
Right. I'm curious about the response from the mainstream community, what that's going to be. What's been the initial pulse, you know, from folks that are really, you know, that believe in the ApoB crashing into the vessel wall hypothesis? What's been the response? Has it been quiet? Are people analyzing?
I think it's a combination. A number of them are still digesting it. As would be expected, some number of them are looking at any possible flaws with the study. And for what it's worth, I invite that. It's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
We want to be tested as best as we can. What's interesting to me is, at least as of the time we're recording this, in the 24 hours since it dropped, the biggest thing that was getting circulation was that in this sub-analysis that Adrian put out in the supplemental, it did these different groups of comparisons, and he had one where it isolated, I want to say it's either 27 or 17, I think it was 17, that had a calcification, a CAC score of 100 or higher in our group of 100, right? And the pushback from some who are pro lipid lowering were saying, hey, wait a sec, if you look at that against these other reference groups that are listed there as well, they're doing worse. Their PAV delta change is higher. To which I pointed out now several times, I don't know why it hasn't stuck yet, the other reference groups include folks that have CAC under 100, including some that have CAC of 0. So it's not an apples to apples.
Yeah.
What would be great is if we could get subgroup analyses from those same study populations for those that did have a CAC of 100 or higher, because of course that'd be a higher risk. That's maybe the largest one. Other than that, what's interesting is the biggest pushback, even before this got published, is that it's now moved to, well, it's a small number of people. It's a small fraction of the total.
Yeah, right.
Which, for what it's worth, I'll take.
Yeah.
Because is it a small fraction of the total U.S. population that's metabolically healthy? That's right. It is. Okay. Can we all agree together, pro LDL lowering or not, that metabolic health is a far higher cardiovascular disease risk factor than LDL?
Yeah.
I hope we can.
Yeah.
Right?
Hopefully that's a take home. Yeah.
So if the pushback is, hey, you're putting your thumb on the scale by having metabolically healthy people with sky high LDL, when clearly that's very relevant to the cardiovascular disease risk, again, I'll take that.
Yeah.
The conversation's moving where I'd like it to be anyway.
Right. I agree. The other blowback I was thinking was, well, it's only a year. That's a short period of time.
The year, for what it's worth, so two things. One, baseline is 4.7 years. So with the added year, we're at 5.7 years. And it's fair to say it's a year between the two longitudinal data points. However, that 1 year, we would expect to see plaque change for the magnitude of LDL. So to level set this a little bit more, you're probably familiar with a lot of landmark lipid studies. Double-blind, randomized control trials. What's the average time span they go?
I mean, most are like 12 weeks or something. I don't know.
No. So here's a good example of Jupiter. It's 1.9 years.
Okay.
Right. So that was one of the most influential studies, particularly for primary prevention, although its criteria required you to have a high CRP. But anyway, but 1.9 years. And they stated that this is some of the best data because it had events and it reached a statistically significant amount of events such that they could stop it. All right. So can you have 1 year of data at high resolution CT angiography where you're actually tracking the plaque, not even events, but the plaque change? Yes. Can we say LDL affects plaque such that you end up with these events? Well, yeah, that's the present lipid hypothesis, is the deposition of the cholesterol resulting in the expansion of foam cells and so forth. So would we likewise acknowledge that if we already have all these other longitudinal 1 year studies that also show changes in plaque and that they are influencing existing care based on the medications involved? That's one. But two, when you take studies like Jupiter that are based on events, are you really going to make the claim that changes in LDL for something like Jupiter are affecting events but not affecting plaque?
Right.
That's a new hypothesis and not one I'm aware of. So no, if you're looking at studies overall for how well the intervention could be meaningful, and you're looking at ours being 5.7 years, I'm interested if you're only going to accept studies that are over 5.7 years.
Yeah.
Because even beyond the intervention itself, if we're seeing how high these LDL levels were going, again, the cumulative amount between our group and Miami Heart was 700 milligram per deciliter accumulation, right? these studies often don't have that much of a change in LDL relative to the amount that we increased.
Right.
So when you get down to the math, I mean, it's a substantial magnitude of difference. It should, of course, be understood in that context.
Mm-hmm. Any one of the 100 participants in the lean mass hyperresponder group, had they ever had an event? Was that
no, that would have been reported to us.
Mm.
Yeah, as in during the study, was there an event?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
And for what it's worth, that was, something there was a concern that I had, actually still kind of have to some degree, which is in the lean mass hyperresponder Facebook group, as is typical for people who are more metabolically healthy, getting back to those runners.
Yeah.
You do have overexercisers.
Mm-hmm.
They're around.
Yeah.
And again, they don't know until they're getting heart scans that they're not in good shape. I talked about this with the investigators from day one. This is my one worry, is that we're not going to get people who aren't in some way confounded by the potential of being overexercisers.
Mm.
I already know a number of them myself.
Mm-hmm. Is that a term that's used in the medical jargon, or is that something that you created? Because I mean,
overexercise?
Yeah.
I think I've read it in a number of papers.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that one in particular is, I don't know.
I'm just curious. I'm not like debating. I'm just like, okay, I need to dive into this because
it's conceptual, of course.
For sure. Yeah. Interesting.
I would almost want to call them, in my mind, what I would describe them as is just folks who are not providing enough recovery to meet their reparative needs.
Mm-hmm. It's important.
Or, I don't know, pushing yourself to a point in which you're breaking bones or, whatever.
Yeah, it's beyond physiologically healthy, but it's fun. I mean, I would put myself in that category. So I
overexerciser?
Yeah. I used to bike race, and we would do 120-mile bike rides on the weekends, and I wanted to be a professional and stuff. And then I got into more weightlifting and CrossFit and this and that. And some of the hikes that my daughter and I do, we do like 32-mile trips over a couple of days. We're going to hike the Grand Canyon next week, 26 miles or something. So, but I don't run, but I don't know. I think it's interesting. But Dave, this has been amazing.
It has been. One second. Actually, yeah. Do you want to wrap here?
Probably, yeah.
Okay, all right. So, yeah, thanks for joining me doing this kind of crossways.
This was amazing.
It was
a lot of fun.
It was. So, how can people find you?
Thank you. Yeah, highintensityhealth.com. And yourself?
I'm on X as Real Dave Feldman. You can also find me on Instagram as Real Dave Feldman. If you're interested in helping us with the research, you can donate at citizensciencefoundation.org.
Nice.